Section 37 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Reynolds. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 3, Part 2b. If it became necessary to abandon the hope of finding in these circumpolar regions countries in which gold abounded as it did in Peru, there was no ground for not continuing to seek there for a passage to China, an opinion supported by very skilful sailors, and one which found many adherents among the merchants of London. By the aid of several high personages, 2 ships were equipped, the Sunshine of 50 tons burden, carrying a crew of 23 in number, and the Moonshine of 35 tons. They quitted Portsmouth on the 7th of June, 1585, under the command of John Davis. Davis discovered the entrance of the strait which received his name, and was obliged to cross immense fields of drifting ice, after having reassured his crew, who were frightened while in the midst of a dense fog, by the dash of the icebergs and the splitting of the blocks of ice. On the 20th July, Davis discovered the Land of Desolation, but without being able to disembark upon it. 9 days later he entered Gilbert Bay, where he found a peaceable population, who gave him sealskins and furs in exchange for some trifling articles. These natives, some days afterwards, arrived in such numbers that there were not less than 37 canoes around Davis's vessels. In this place the navigator perceived an enormous quantity of driftwood, amongst which he mentions an entire tree, which could not have been less than 60 feet in length. On the 6th of August he cast anchor in a fine bay called Totnes, near a mountain of the colour of gold, which received the name of Raleigh. At the same time he gave the names of Dyer and Walshingham to 2 capes of that land of Cumberland. During 11 days Davis still sailed northwards on a very open sea, free from ice, and of which the water had the colour of the ocean. Already he believed himself at the entrance of the sea, which communicated with the Pacific, when all at once the weather changed, and became so foggy that he was forced to return to Yarmouth, where he landed on the 30th of September. Davis had the skill to make the owners of his ships partake in the hope which he had conceived. Thus, on the 7th of May, 1586, he set out again with the 2 ships which had made the previous voyage. To them were added the Mermaid of 120 tons, and the pinnace North Star. When, on the 25th of June, he arrived at the southern point of Greenland, Davis dispatched the Sunshine and the North Star towards the north, in order to search for a passage upon the eastern coast, while he pursued the same route as in the preceding year, and penetrated into the strait which bears his name as far as 69 degrees. But there was a much greater quantity of ice this year, and on the 17th of July, the expedition fell in with an ice field, of such extent that it took 13 days to coast along it. The wind after passing over this icy plain was so cold that the rigging and sails were frozen, and the sailors refused to go any further. It was needful, therefore, to descend again to the east-southeast. There Davis explored the land of Cumberland, without finding the strait he was seeking, and after a skirmish with the Esquimaux, in which 3 of his men were killed and 2 wounded, he set out on the 19th of September on his return to England. Although once more his researches had not been crowned with success, Davis still had good hope, as is witnessed by a letter which he wrote to the company, in which he said that he had reduced the existence of the passage to a species of certainty. Foreseeing, however, that he would have more trouble in obtaining the dispatch of a new expedition, he added that the expenses of the enterprise would be fully covered by the profit arising from the fishery of walrus, seals, and whales, which were so numerous in those parts that they appeared to have there established their headquarters. On the 15th of May, 1587, he set sail with the Sunshine, the Elizabeth of Dartmouth, and the Helen of London. This time he went farther north than he had ever done before, and reached 72 degrees 12 minutes, that is to say, nearly the latitude of Upernavik, and he descried Cape Henderson's Hope. Stopped by the ice and forced to retrace his way, he sailed in Frobisher's Strait, and after having crossed a large gulf, he arrived in 61 degrees 10 minutes latitude, in sight of a cape to which he gave the name of Chudleigh. This cape is a part of the Labrador coast, and forms the southern entrance to Hudson's Bay. After coasting along the American shores as far as 52 degrees, Davis set out for England, which he reached on the 15th of September. Although the solution of the problem had not been found, yet, nevertheless, precious results had been obtained, but results to which people at the period did not attach any great value. Nearly the half of Baffin's Bay had been explored, and clear ideas had been obtained of its shores, and of the people inhabiting them. These were considerable acquisitions, from a geographical point of view, but they were scarcely those which would greatly affect the merchants of the city. In consequence, the attempts at finding a northwest passage were abandoned by the English for a somewhat long period. A new nation was just come into existence. The Dutch, while scarcely delivered from the Spanish yoke, inaugurated that commercial policy which was destined to make the greatness and prosperity of their country, by the successive dispatch of several expeditions to seek for a way to China by the northeast. The same project, formerly conceived by Sebastian Cabot, and which had given to England the Russian trade. With their practical instinct, the Dutch had acquainted themselves with English navigation. They had even established factories at Kola and Archangel, but they wished to proceed further in their search for new markets. The Sea of Kara appeared to them too difficult. They resolved, acting on the advice of the cosmographer Plancius, to try a new way by the north of Nova Zembla. The merchants of Amsterdam applied therefore to an experienced sailor, William Barents, born in the island of Terschelling, near the Texel. This navigator set out from the Texel in 1594, on board the Mercure, doubled the North Cape, saw the island of Waigatz, and found himself on the 4th of July in sight of the coast of Nova Zembla, in latitude 73 degrees 25 minutes. He sailed along the coast, doubled Cape Nassau on the 10th of July, and 3 days later he came in contact with the ice. Until the 3rd of August he attempted to open a passage through the pack, testing the mass of ice on various sides, going up as far as the Orange Islands at the north-western extremity of Nova Zembla, sailing over 1,700 miles of ground, and putting his ship about no less than 81 times. We do not imagine that any navigator had hitherto displayed such perseverance. Let us add that he turned this long cruise to account, to fix astronomically, and with remarkable accuracy, the latitude of various points. At last, wearied with the fruitless boxing about along the edge of the pack, the crew cried for mercy, and it became necessary to return to the Texel. The results obtained were judged so important that the following year the Dutch States General entrusted to Jacob van Heemskerk the command of a fleet of 7 vessels, of which Barents was named chief pilot. After touching at various points upon the coast of Nova Zembla and of Asia, this squadron was forced by the pack to go back without having made any important discovery, and it returned to Holland on the 18th of September. As a general rule, governments do not possess as much perseverance as do private individuals. The large fleet of the year 1595 had cost a great sum of money, and had produced no results. This was sufficient to discourage the States General. The merchants of Amsterdam, therefore, substituting private enterprise for the action of the government, which merely promised a reward to the man who should first discover the north-east passage, fitted out 2 vessels, of which the command was given to Heemskerk and to Jan Cornelzoon Rijp, while Barentz, who had only the title of pilot, was virtually the leader of the expedition. The historian of the voyage, Gerrit de Veer, was also on board as second mate. The Dutchman sailed from Amsterdam on the 10th of May, 1596, passed by the Shetland and Faroe Islands, and on the 5th of June saw the first masses of ice, whereat we were much amazed, believing at first that they were white swans. They soon arrived at the south of Spitzbergen, at Bear Island, upon which they landed on the 11th of June. They collected there a great number of seagulls' eggs, and after much trouble killed at some distance inland a white bear, destined to give its name to the land which Barentz had just discovered. On the 19th of June they disembarked upon some far-spreading land, which they took to be a part of Greenland, and to which on account of the sharp-pointed mountains they gave the name of Spitzbergen. Of this they explored a considerable portion of the western coast. Forced by the polar pack to go southwards again to Bear Island, they separated there from Rijp, who was once more to endeavour to find a way by the north. On the 11th of July, Heemskerk and Barentz were in the parts of Cape Cannon, and 5 days later they had reached the western coast of Nova Zembla, which was called Willoughby's Land. They then altered their course, and again going northwards, they arrived on the 19th at the island of Crosses, where the ice which was still attached to the shore barred their passage. They remained in this place until the 4th of August, and 2 days later they doubled Cape Nassau. After several changes in course, which it would take too long to relate, they reached the Orange Islands at the northern extremity of Nova Zembla. They began to descend the eastern coast, but were soon obliged to enter a harbour, where they found themselves completely blocked by the pack-ice, and in which they were forced in great cold, poverty, misery, and grief to stay all the winter. This was on the 26th of August. On the 30th, the masses of ice began to pile themselves one upon another against the ship, with snow falling. The ship was lifted up and surrounded in such a manner that all that was about her and around her began to crack and split. It seemed as if the ship must break into 1,000 pieces, a thing most terrible to see and to hear, and fit to make one's hair stand on end. The ship was afterwards in equal danger when the ice formed beneath, raising her and bearing her up as though she had been lifted by some instrument. Soon the ship cracked to such a degree that prudence dictated the debarkation of some of the provisions, sails, gunpowder, lead, the arquebuses, as well as other arms, and the erection of a tent or hut, in which the men might be sheltered from the snow and from any attacks by bears. Some days later, some sailors who had advanced from 4 to 6 miles inland, found near a river of fresh water a quantity of driftwood. They discovered there also the traces of wild goats and of reindeer. On the 11th of September, seeing that the bay was filled with enormous blocks of ice piled one upon the other, and welded together, the Dutchmen perceived that they would be obliged to winter in this place, and resolved, in order to be better defended against the cold and armed against the wild beasts, to build a house there which might be able to contain them all, while they would leave to itself the ship, which became each day less safe and comfortable. Fortunately, they found upon the shore whole trees, coming doubtless from Siberia, and driven here by the current, and in such quantity that they sufficed not only for the construction of their habitation, but also for firewood throughout the winter. Never yet had any European wintered in these regions, in the midst of that slothful and immovable sea, which, according to the very false expressions used by Tacitus, forms the girdle of the world, and which is heard the uproar caused by the rising of the sun. The Dutchmen, therefore, were unable to picture to themselves the sufferings which threatened them. They bore them, however, with admirable patience, without a single murmur, and without the least want of discipline or attempt at mutiny. The conduct of these brave seamen, quite ignorant of what so apparently dark a future might have in reserve for them, but who with wonderful faith had placed their affairs in the hands of God, may be always proposed as an example even to the sailors of the present day. It may well be said they had really in their hearts the ace triplex of which Horace speaks. It was owing to the skill, knowledge, and foresight of their leader Barentz, as much as to their own spirit of obedience, that the Dutch sailors ever came forth from Nova Zembla, which threatened to be their tomb, and again saw the shores of their own country. The bears, which were extremely numerous at that period of the year, made frequent visits to the crew. More than one was killed, but the Dutchmen contented themselves with skinning them for the sake of their fur, and did not eat them, probably because they believed the flesh to be unwholesome. It would have been, however, a considerable addition to their food, and would have saved them from using their salted meat, and thus they might longer have escaped the attacks of scurvy. But that we may not anticipate. Let us continue to follow the journal of Gerrit de Veer. On the 23rd of September, the carpenter died, and was interred the next day in the cleft of a mountain, it being impossible to put a spade into the ground on account of the severity of the frost. The following days were devoted to the transport of driftwood and the building of the house. To cover it in, it was necessary to demolish the fore and aft cabins of the ship. The roof was put on the 2nd October, and a piece of frozen snow was set up like a maypole. On the 31st September there was a strong wind from the northwest, and as far as the eye could reach, the sea was entirely open and without ice. But we remained as though taken and arrested in the ice, and the ship was raised full 2 or 3 feet upon the ice, and we could imagine nothing else but that the water must be frozen quite to the bottom, although it was 3 fathoms and a half in depth. On the 12th October they began to sleep in the house, although it was not completed. On the 21st the greater part of the provisions, furniture, and everything which might be wanted, was withdrawn from the ship, for they felt certain that the sun was about to disappear. A chimney was fixed in the centre of the roof. Inside, a Dutch clock was hung up, bed places were formed along the walls, and a wine cask was converted into a bath, for the surgeon had wisely prescribed to the men frequent bathing as a preservative of health. The quantity of snow which fell during this winter was really marvellous. The house disappeared entirely beneath this thick covering, which, however, sensibly raised the temperature within. Every time that they wished to go forth, the Dutchmen were obliged to hollow out a long corridor beneath the snow. Each night they first heard the bears, and then the foxes, which walked upon the top of the dwelling, and tried to tear off some planks from the roof, that they might get into the house. So the sailors were accustomed to climb into the chimney, whence, as from a watchtower, they could shoot the animals and drive them off. They had manufactured a great number of snares, into which fell numbers of blue foxes, the valuable fur of which served as protection against the cold, while their flesh enabled the sailors to economize their provisions. Always cheerful and good-tempered, they bore equally well the ennui of the long polar night and the severity of the cold, which was so extreme, that during 2 of 3 days, when they had not been able to keep so large a fire as usual, on account of the smoke being driven back again by the wind, it froze so hard in the house that the walls and the floor were covered with ice to the depth of 2 fingers, even in the cots where these poor people were sleeping. It was necessary to thaw the sherry when it was served out, as it was done every 2 days, at the rate of half a pint. On the 7th of December the rough weather continued, with a violent storm coming from the northeast, which produced horrible cold. We knew no means of guarding ourselves against it, and while we were consulting together what we could do for the best, one of our men, in his extreme necessity, proposed to make use of the coal which we had brought from the ship into our house, and to make a fire of it, because it burns with great heat and lasts a long time. In the evening we lighted a large fire of this coal, which threw out a great heat, but we did not provide against what might happen, for as the heat revived us completely, we tried to retain it for a long time. To this end we thought it well to stop up all the doors and the chimney, to keep in the delightful warmth. And thus each went to repose in his cot, and animated by the acquired warmth, we discoursed long together. But in the end we were seized with a giddiness in the head, some, however, more than others. This was first perceived to be the case with one of our men who was ill, and who for this reason had less power of resistance. And we also ourselves were sensible of a great pain which attacked us, so that several of the bravest came out of their cots and began by unstopping the chimney, and afterwards opening the door. But the man who opened the door fainted and fell senseless upon the snow, on perceiving which I ran to him and found him lying on the ground in a fainting fit. I went in haste to seek for some vinegar, and with it I rubbed his face until he recovered from his swoon. Afterwards, when we were somewhat restored, the captain gave to each a little wine, in order to comfort our hearts. On the 11th the weather continued fine, but so extremely cold that no one who had not felt it could imagine it. Even our shoes, frozen to our feet, were as hard as horn, and inside they were covered with ice in such a manner that we could no longer use them. The garments which we wore were quite white with frost and ice. On Christmas Day, the 25th December, the weather was as rough as on the preceding days. The foxes made havoc upon the house, which one of the sailors declared to be a bad omen, and upon being asked why he said so, answered, "Because we cannot put them in a pot or on the spit, which would have been a good omen." If the year 1596 had closed with excessive cold, the commencement of 1597 was not more agreeable. Most violent storms of snow and hard frost prevented the Dutchmen from leaving the house. They celebrated Twelfth Night with a gaiety, as is related in the simple and touching narrative of Gerrit de Vere. For this purpose we besought the captain to allow us a little diversion in the midst of our sufferings, and to let us use a part of the wine which was destined to be served out to us every other day. Having 2 pounds of flour, we made some pancakes with oil, and each one brought a white biscuit, which we soaked in the wine and eat. And it seemed to us that we were in our own country, and amongst our relations and friends, and we were as much diverted as if a banquet had been given in our honour, so much did we relish our entertainment. We also made a Twelfth Night king, by means of paper, and our master gunner was king of Nova Zembla, which is a country enclosed between 2 seas, and of the great length of 600 miles. After the 21st January, the foxes became less numerous. The bears reappeared, and daylight began to increase, which enabled the Dutchmen, who had been so long confined to the house, to go out a little. On the 24th, one of the sailors who had been long ill died, and was buried in the snow at some distance from the house. On the 28th, the weather being very fine, the men all went out, walking about, running for exercise, and playing at bowls, to take off the stiffness of their limbs, for they were extremely weak, and nearly all suffering from scurvy. They were so much enfeebled that they were obliged to go to work several times before they could carry to their house the wood which was needful. At length, in the first days of March, after several tempests and driving snowstorms, they were able to verify the fact that there was no ice in the sea. Nevertheless, the weather was still rough and the cold glacial. It was not feasible as yet to put to sea again, and rather because the ship was still embedded in the ice. On the 15th of April, the sailors paid a visit to her, and found her in fairly good condition. At the beginning of May, the men became somewhat impatient, and asked Barentz if he were not soon intending to make the necessary preparations for departure. But Barentz answered that he must wait until the end of the month, and then, if it should be impossible to set the ship free, he would take measures to prepare the long-boats, and the launch, and to render them fit for a sea voyage. On the 20th of the month, the preparations for departure commenced. With what joy and ardour it is easy to imagine. The launch was repaired, the sails were mended, and both boats were dragged to the sea, and provisions put on board. Then, seeing that the water was free, and that a strong wind was blowing, Heemskerk went to see Barentz, who had been long ill, and declared to him that it seemed good to him to set out from thence, and in God's name to commence the voyage, and abandon Nova Zembla. William Barentz had before this written a paper setting forth how we had started from Holland to go towards the kingdom of China, and all that had happened, in order that, if by chance some one should come after us, it might be known what had befallen us. This note he enclosed in that case of a musket, which he hung up in the chimney. On the 13th June, 1597, the Dutchmen abandoned the ship which had not stirred from her icy prison, and commending themselves to the protection of God, the 2 open boats put to sea. They reached the Orange Islands, and again descended the western coast of Nova Zembla in the midst of ceaselessly recurring dangers. On the 20th of June, Nicholas Andrew became very weak, and we saw clearly that he would soon expire. The lieutenant of the governor came on board our launch, and told us that Nicholas Andrew was very much indisposed, and that it was very evident that his days would soon end. Upon which William Barentz said, "It appears to me that my life also will be very short." We did not imagine that Barentz was so ill, for we were chatting together, and William Barentz was looking at the little chart which I had made of our voyage, and we had various discourses together. Finally he laid down the chart and said to me, "Gerard, give me something to drink." After he had drunk, such weakness supervened that his eyes turned into his head, and he died so suddenly that we had not time to call the captain, who was in the other boat. This death of William Barentz saddened us greatly, seeing that he was our principal leader and our sole pilot, in whom we had placed our whole trust. But we could not oppose the will of God, and this thought quieted us a little. Thus died the illustrious Barentz, like his successors Franklin and Hall, in the midst of his discoveries. In the measured and sober words of the short funeral oration of Gerrit de Veer may be perceived the affection, sympathy, and confidence which this brave sailor had been able to inspire in his unfortunate companions. Barentz is one of the glories of Holland, so prolific in brave and skilful navigators. We shall mention presently what has been done to honour his memory. After having been forced several times to haul the boats out of the water when they were on the point of being crushed between the blocks of ice, after having seen on various occasions the sea open and again close before them, after having suffered both from thirst and hunger, the Dutchmen reached Cape Nassau. One day, being obliged to draw up the longboat, which was in danger of being stove in upon an iceberg, the sailors lost a part of their provisions, and were all deluged with water, for the ice broke away under their feet. In the midst of so much misery, they sometimes met with good windfalls. Thus, when they were upon the ice on the island of Crosses, they found there 70 eggs of the mountain duck, but they did not know what they should put them in to carry them. At length one man took off his breeches, tying them together by the ends, and having put the eggs into them, they carried them on a pike between 2, while the 3rd man carried the musket. The eggs were very welcome, and we eat them like lords. From the 19th July, the Dutchmen sailed over a sea, which, if not altogether free from ice, was at least clear of those great fields of ice which had given them so much trouble to avoid. On the 28th July, when entering the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they met with 2 Russian vessels, which at first they dared not approach. But when they saw the sailors come to them unarmed, and with friendly demonstrations, they put aside all fear, and rather as they recognized in the Russians some people whom they had met with the year before in the neighbourhood of Waigatz, the Dutchmen received some assistance from them, and then continued their voyage, still keeping along the coast of Nova Zembla, and as close to the shore as the ice would allow. Upon one occasion, when they landed, they discovered the cochlearia, scurvy grass, a plant of which the leaves and seeds form one of the most powerful of known antiscorbutics. They eat them, therefore, by handfuls, and immediately experienced great relief. Their provisions were, however, nearly exhausted. They had only a little bread remaining, and scarcely any meat. They decided, therefore, to take to the open sea, in order to shorten the distance which separated them from the coast of Russia, where they still hoped to fall in with some fishermen's boats, from which they might obtain assistance. In this hope they were not deceived, although they still had many trials to undergo. The Russians were much touched by their misfortunes, and consented on several occasions to bestow provisions upon them, which prevented the Dutch sailors from dying of hunger. In consequence of a thick fog, the two boats were separated from each other, and did not come together again until some distance beyond Cape Cannon, on the further side of the White Sea, at Kilden Island, where some fishermen informed the Dutchmen that at Kola there were 3 ships belonging to their nation, which were ready to put to sea on their return to their own country. They therefore dispatched thither one of their men, accompanied by a Laplander, who returned 3 days afterwards with a letter signed Jan Rip. Great was the astonishment of the Dutch at the sight of this signature. It was only on comparing the letter just received with several others which Heemskerk had in his possession, that they were convinced that it really came from the captain who had accompanied them the preceding year. Some days later, on the 30th September, Rip himself arrived with a boat laden with provisions, to seek them out and take them to the Kola River, in which his ship was at anchor. Rip was greatly astonished at all they related to him, and at the terrible voyage of nearly 1200 miles which they had made, and which had not taken less than 104 days, namely from the 13th June to the 25th September. Some days of repose accompanied by wholesome and abundant food sufficed to clear off the last remains of scurvy, and to refresh the sailors after their fatigues. On the 17th September, Jan Rip left the Kola River, and on the 1st November the Dutch crew arrived at Amsterdam. "We had on," says Gerrit de Veer, "the same garments which we wore in Nova Zembla, having on our heads caps of white fox skin, and we repaired to the house of Peter Hasselaer, who had been one of the guardians of the town of Amsterdam, charged with presiding over the fitting out of the 2 ships of Jan Rip, and of our own captain. Arriving at this house in the midst of general astonishment, because that we had been long thought to be dead, and this report had been spread throughout the town, the news of our arrival reached the palace of the prince, where there were then at table the chancellor and the ambassador of the high and mighty king of Denmark and Norway, of the Goths and the Vandals. We were then brought before them by M. Lecouttet, and 2 lords of the town, and we gave to the said Lord Ambassador, and to their lordships the burgomasters, a narrative of our voyage. Afterwards, each of us retired to his own house. Those who had not dwellings in the town were lodged in an inn until such time as we received our money, when each went his own way. These are the names of the men who returned from this voyage: Jacob Heemskerk, clerk and captain; Peter Petersen Vos, Gerrit de Veer, mate; Jan Vos, surgeon; Jacob Jansen Sterenberg; Leonard Henry; Lawrence William; Jan Hillebrandts; Jacob Jensen Hoechwood; Peter Corneel; Jacob Dubursen; and Jacob Everts. Of all these brave sailors we have nothing further to record, except that De Veer published the following year the narrative of his voyage, and that Heemskerk, after having made several cruises to India, received in 1607 the command of a fleet of 26 vessels, at the head of which, on the 25th of April, he had a severe battle with the Spaniards under the guns of Gibraltar, in which battle, although the Dutch were conquerors, Heemskerk lost his life. The spot where the unfortunate Barentz and his companions had wintered was not revisited until 1871, nearly 300 years after their time. The first to double the northern point of Nova Zembla, Barentz had remained alone in the achievement until this period. On the 7th September, 1871, the Norwegian captain Elling Carlsen, well known by his numerous voyages in the North Sea and the Frozen Ocean, arrived at the ice haven of Barentz, and on the 9th he discovered the house which had sheltered the Dutchmen. It was in such a wonderful state of preservation that it seemed to have been built but a day, and everything was found in the same position as at the departure of the shipwrecked crew. Bears, foxes, and other creatures inhabiting these inhospitable regions had alone visited the spot. Around the house were standing some large puncheons, and there were heaps of seal, bear, and walrus bones. Inside, everything was in its place. It was the faithful reproduction of the curious engraving of Gerrit de Veer. The bed places were arranged along the partition as they are shown in the drawing, as well as the clock, the muskets, and the halberd. Amongst the household utensils, the arms, and the various objects brought away by Captain Carlson, we may mention 2 copper cooking pans, some goblets, gun barrels, augers, and chisels, a pair of boots, 19 cartridge cases, of which some were still filled with powder, the clock, a flute, some locks and padlocks, 26 pewter candlesticks, some fragments of engravings, and 3 books in Dutch, one of which, the last edition of Mendoza's History of China, shows the goal which Barentz sought in this expedition, and a manual of navigation, proves the care taken by the pilot to keep himself well up in all professional matters. Upon his return to the port of Hammerfest, Captain Carlson met with a Dutchman, Mr. Lister Kay, who purchased the Barentz relics and forwarded them to the authorities of the Netherlands. These objects have been placed in the Naval Museum at The Hague, where a house open in front has been constructed precisely similar to the one represented in the drawing of Gerrit de Veer, and each object or instrument brought back has been placed in the very position which it occupied in the house in Nova Zembla. Surrounded by all the respect and affection which they merit, these precious witnesses of a maritime event so important as the first wintering in the Arctic regions, these touching reminiscences of Barents Heemskirk and their rough companions, constitute one of the most interesting monuments in the museum. Beside the clock is placed a copper dial, through the middle of which a meridian is drawn. This curious dial, invented by Plancius, which served without doubt to determine the variations of the compass, is now the only example extant of a nautical instrument which has never been in very general use. For this reason, it is as precious as, from another point of view, are the flute used by Barentz, and the shoes of the poor sailor who died during the winter sojourn. It is impossible to behold this curious collection without experiencing poignant emotion. End of second part, Chapter 3, Part 2b. Recording by Stephen Reynolds, Durham, Connecticut. Section 38 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Reynolds. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World by Jules Verne, Second Part, Chapter 4, Part 1. Voyages of Adventure and Privateering Warfare. A very poor cottage at Tavistock in Devonshire was the birthplace in 1540 of Francis Drake, who was destined to gain millions by his indomitable courage, which however he lost with as much facility as he had obtained them. Edmund Drake, his father, was one of those clergy who devote themselves to the education of the people. His poverty was only equalled by the respect which was felt for his character. Burdened with a family as he was, the father of Francis Drake found himself obliged from necessity to allow his son to embrace the maritime profession, for which he had an ardent longing, and to serve as cabin boy on board a coasting vessel which traded with Holland. Industrious, active, self-reliant, and saving, the young Francis Drake had soon acquired all the theoretical knowledge needed for the direction of a vessel. When he had realized a small sum, which was increased by the sale of a vessel bequeathed to him by his first master, he made more extended voyages. He visited the Bay of Biscay and the Gulf of Guinea, and laid out all his capital in purchasing a cargo which he hoped to sell in the West Indies. But no sooner had he arrived at Rio de la Hacha than both ship and cargo were confiscated. We know not under what frivolous pretext. All the remonstrances of Drake, who thus saw himself ruined, were useless. He vowed to avenge himself for such a piece of injustice, and he kept his word. In 1567, 2 years after this adventure, a small fleet of 6 vessels, of which the largest was of 700 tons burden, left Plymouth with the sanction of the Queen to make an expedition to the coasts of Mexico. Drake was in command of a ship of 50 tons. At first starting, they captured some negroes on the Cape de Verde Islands, a sort of rehearsal of what was destined to take place in Mexico. Then they besieged La Mina, where some more negroes were taken, which they sold at the Antilles. Hawkins, doubtless by the advice of Drake, captured the town of Rio de la Hacha, after which he reached St. Jean d'Ulloa, having encountered a fearful storm. But the harbour contained a numerous fleet, and was defended by formidable artillery. The English fleet was defeated, and Drake had much difficulty in regaining the English coast in January 1568. Drake afterwards made 2 expeditions to the West Indies for the purpose of studying the country. When he considered himself to have acquired the necessary information, he fitted out 2 vessels at his own expense, the Swan, of 25 tons, commanded by his brother John, and the Pasha of Plymouth, of 70 tons. The 2 vessels had as crew 73 jack-tars, who could be thoroughly depended on. From July 1572 to August 1573, sometimes alone, sometimes in concert with certain Captain Ross, Drake made a lucrative cruise upon the coasts of the Gulf of Darien, attacked the towns of Vera Cruz and of Nombre de Dios, and obtained considerable spoil. Unfortunately, these enterprises were not carried out without much cruelty and many acts of violence, which would make men of the present day blush. But we will not dwell upon the scenes of piracy and barbarity which are only too frequently met with in the 16th century. After assisting in the suppression of the rebellion in Ireland, Drake, whose name was beginning to be well known, was presented to Queen Elizabeth. He laid before her his project of going to ravage the western coasts of South America, by passing through the Strait of Magellan, and he obtained, with the title of Admiral, a fleet of 6 vessels, on board which were 160 picked sailors. Francis Drake started from Plymouth on the 15th November, 1577. He had some intercourse with the Moors of Mogador, of which he had no reason to boast, made some capture of small importance before arriving at the Cape de Verde Islands, where he took in fresh provisions, and then was 56 days in crossing the Atlantic and reaching the coast of Brazil, which he followed as far as the estuary of La Plata, where he laid in a supply of water. He afterwards arrived at the Seal Bay in Patagonia, where he traded with the natives, and killed a great number of penguins and sea wolves for the nourishment of his crew. Some of the Patagonians, who were seen on the 13th May a little below Seal Bay, says the original narrative, wore on the head a kind of horn, and nearly all had many beautiful birds' feathers by way of hats. They also had the face painted and diversified by several kinds of colours, and they each held a bow in the hand from which every time they drew it they discharged 2 arrows. They were very agile, and as far as we could see, well instructed in the art of making war, for they kept good order in marching and advancing, and for so few men as they were, they made themselves appear a large number. M. Charton, in his Voyages Anciens et Modernes, notices that Drake does not mention the extraordinary stature which Magellan had attributed to the Patagonians. For this there is more than one good reason. There exists in Patagonia more than one tribe, and the description here given by Drake of the savages whom he met does not at all resemble that given by Pigafetta of the Patagonians of Port St. Julien. If there exist, as seems now to be proved, a race of men of great stature, their habitat appears fixed upon the shores of the strait at the southern extremity of Patagonia, and not at 15 days' sail from the Port Desire, at which Drake arrived on the 2nd June. On the following day he reached the harbour of St. Julien, where he found a gibbet erected of yore by Magellan for the punishment of some rebellious members of his crew. Drake, in his turn, chose this spot to rid himself of one of his captains, named Doughty, who had been long accused of treason and underhand dealing, and who on several occasions had separated himself from the fleet. Some sailors having confessed that he had solicited them to join with him in frustrating the voyage, Doughty was convicted of the crimes of rebellion and of tampering with the sailors, and according to the laws of England he was condemned by a court-martial to be beheaded. This sentence was immediately executed, although Doughty, until the last moment, vehemently declared his innocence. Was his guilt thoroughly proved? If Drake were accused upon his return to England, in spite of the moderation which he always evinced towards his men, of having taken advantage of the opportunity to get rid of a rival whom he dreaded, it is difficult to conceive that the 40 judges who pronounced the sentence should have concerted together to further the secret designs of their admiral and condemn an innocent man. On the 20th of August the fleet, now reduced to 3 vessels, 2 of the ships having been so much damaged that they were at once destroyed by the admiral, entered the strait, which had not been traversed since the time of Magellan. Although he met with fine harbours, Drake found that it was difficult to anchor in them, on account of the depth of the water close to the shore, and of the violence of the wind, which, blowing as it did in sudden squalls, rendered navigation dangerous. During a storm which was encountered at the point where the strait opens into the Pacific, Drake beheld one of his ships founder, while his last companion was separated from him a few days afterwards. Nor did he see her again until the end of the campaign. Driven by the currents to the south of the strait as far as 55 degrees 40', Drake had now only his own vessel. But by the injury which he did to the Spaniards, he showed what ravages he would have committed if he had had still under his command the fleet with which he left England. During a descent upon the island of Mocha, the English had 2 men killed and several wounded, while Drake himself, hit by 2 arrows on the head, found himself utterly unable to punish the Indians for their perfidy. In the harbour of Valparaiso he captured a vessel richly laden with the wines of Chile, and with ingots of gold valued at 37,000 ducats. Afterward he pillaged the town, which had been precipitately abandoned by its inhabitants. At Coquimbo the people were forewarned of his approach, so that he found there a strong force, which obliged him to re-embark. At Arica he plundered 3 small vessels, in one of which he found 57 bars of silver valued at £2,006. In the harbour of Lima, where he moored 12 ships or barks, the booty was considerable. But what most rejoiced the heart of Drake was to learn that a galleon named Cagafuego, very richly laden, was sailing toward Paraca. He immediately went in pursuit, capturing on the way a bark carrying 80 pounds of gold, which would be worth 14,080 French crowns. And in the latitude of San Francisco he seized without any difficulty the Cagafuego, in which he found 80 pounds weight of gold. This caused the Spanish pilot to say, laughing, "Captain, our ship ought no longer to be called Cagafuego (Spitfire), but rather Cagaplata (Spit money). It is yours which should be named Cagafuego." After making some other captures, more or less valuable, upon the Peruvian coast, Drake, learning that a considerable fleet was being prepared to oppose him, thought it time to return to England. For this there were 3 different routes open to him. He might again pass the Straits of Magellan, or he might cross the Southern Sea, and doubling the Cape of Good Hope, might so return to the Atlantic Ocean. Or he could sail up the coast of China, and return by the Frozen Sea and the North Cape. It was this last alternative, as being the safest of the 3, which was adopted by Drake. He therefore put out to sea, reached the 38th degree of north latitude, and landed on the shore of the Bay of San Francisco, which had been discovered 3 years previously by Bodega. It was now the month of June, the temperature was very low, and the ground covered with snow. The details given by Drake of his reception by the natives are curious enough. When we arrived, the savages manifested great admiration at the sight of us, and thinking that we were gods, they received us with great humanity and reverence. As long as we remained, they continued to come and visit us, sometimes bringing us beautiful plumes made of feathers of divers colours, and sometimes petun (tobacco), which is a herb in general use among the Indians. But before presenting these things to us, they stopped at a little distance, in a spot where we had pitched our tents. Then they made a long discourse after the manner of a harangue, and when they had finished they laid aside their bows and arrows in that place, and approached us to offer their presents. The first time they came their women remained in the same place, and scratched and tore the skin and flesh of their cheeks, lamenting themselves in a wonderful manner, whereat we were much astonished. But we have since learnt that it was a kind of sacrifice which they offered to us. The facts given by Drake with regard to the Indians of California are almost the only ones which he furnishes upon the manners and customs of the nations which he visited. We would draw the reader's attention here to that custom of long harangues which the traveller especially remarks, just as Cartier had observed upon it 40 years earlier, and which is so noticeable amongst the Canadian Indians at the present day. Drake did not advance farther north, and gave up his project of returning by the frozen sea. When he again set sail, it was to descend toward the Line, to reach the Moluccas, and return to England by the Cape of Good Hope. As this part of the voyage dealt with countries already known, and as the observations made by Drake are neither numerous nor novel, our narrative here shall be brief. On the 13th of October, 1579, Drake arrived in latitude 8 degrees north, at a group of islands, of which the inhabitants had their ears much lengthened by the weight of the ornaments suspended to them. Their nails were allowed to grow, and appeared to serve as defensive weapons, while their teeth, black as ship's pitch, contracted this colour from the use of the betel nut. After resting for a time, Drake passed by the Philippines, and on the 14th of November arrived in Ternate. The king of this island came alongside with 4 canoes bearing his principal officers, dressed in their state costumes. After an interchange of civilities and presents, the English received some rice sugar canes, fowls, figo, cloves, and sago. On the morrow, some of the sailors who had landed were present at a council. When the king arrived, a rich umbrella or parasol all embroidered in gold was borne before him. He was dressed after the fashion of his country, but with extreme magnificence, for he was enveloped from the shoulders with a long cloak of gold, reaching to the ground. He wore as an ornament upon the head a kind of turban made of the same stuff, all worked in fine gold and enriched with jewels and tufts. On his neck there hung a fine gold chain, many times doubled, and formed of broad lengths. On his fingers he had 6 rings of very valuable stones, and his feet were encased in shoes of Morocco leather. After remaining some time in the country to refresh his crew, Drake again put to sea, but his ship on the 9th of January, 1580, struck on a rock, and to float her off it was necessary to throw overboard 8 pieces of ordnance and a large quantity of provisions. A month later Drake arrived at Baratania Island, where he repaired his ship. This island offered much silver, gold, copper, sulphur, spices, lemons, cucumbers, cocoa nuts, and other delicious fruits. We loaded our vessels abundantly with these, being able to certify that since our departure from England we have not visited any place where we have found more comforts in the way of food and fresh provisions than in this island and that of Ternate. After quitting this richly endowed island, Drake landed at Greater Java, where he was very warmly welcomed by the 5 kings amongst whom the island was partitioned, and by the inhabitants. These people are of a fine degree of corpulence. They are great connoisseurs in arms, with which they are well provided, such as swords, daggers, and bucklers, and all these arms are made with much art. Drake had been some little time at Java, when he learnt that not far distant there was a powerful fleet at anchor, which he suspected must belong to Spain. To avoid it he put to sea in all haste. He doubled the Cape of Good Hope during the first days of June, and after stopping at Sierra Leone to take in water, he entered Plymouth Harbour on the 3rd November, 1580, after an absence of 3 years all but a few days. The reception which awaited him in England was at first extremely cold. His having fallen by surprise both upon Spanish towns and ships, at a time when the 2 nations were at peace, rightly caused him to be regarded by a portion of society as a pirate, who tramples under foot the rights of nations. For 5 months the Queen herself, under the pressure of diplomatic proprieties, pretended to be ignorant of his return. But at the end of that time, either because circumstances had altered, or because she did not wish to show herself any longer severe towards the skilful sailor, she repaired to Deptford, where Drake's ship was moored, went on board and conferred the honour of knighthood upon the navigator. From this period, Drake's part as a discoverer is ended, and his afterlife as a warrior and as the implacable enemy of the Spaniards does not concern us. Loaded with honours and invested with important commands, Drake died at sea on the 28th January 1596, during an expedition against the Spaniards. To him pertains the honour of having been the second to pass through the Straits of Magellan, and to have visited Tierra del Fuego as far as the parts about Cape Horn. He also ascended the coast of North America to a point higher than any his predecessors had attained, and he discovered several islands and archipelagos. Being a very clever navigator, he made the transit through the Strait of Magellan with great rapidity. If there are but very few discoveries due to him, this is probably either because he neglected to record them in his journal, or because he often mentions them in so inaccurate a manner that it is scarcely possible to recognize the places. It was he who inaugurated that privateering warfare by which the English, and later on the Dutch, were destined to inflict much injury upon the Spaniards, and the large profits accruing to him from it encouraged his contemporaries, and gave birth in their minds to the love for long and hazardous voyages. Among all those who took example by Drake, the most illustrious was undoubtedly Thomas Cavendish, or Candish. Cavendish joined the English marine service at a very early age, and passed a most stormy youth, during which he rapidly dissipated his modest fortune. That which play had robbed him of, he resolved to recover from the Spaniards. Having in 1585 obtained letters of marque, he made a cruise to the East Indies, and returned with considerable booty. Encouraged by his easy success as a highwayman on the great maritime roads, he thought that if he could acquire some honour and glory while engaged in making his fortune, so much the better would it be for him. With this idea he bought 3 ships, the Desire of 20 tons, the Content of 60 tons, and the Hugh Gallant of 40 tons, upon which he embarked 123 soldiers and sailors. Setting sail on the 22nd July 1586, he passed by the Canaries and landed at Sierra Leone, which town he attacked and plundered. Then, sailing again, he crossed the Atlantic, sighted Cape Sebastian in Brazil, sailed along the coast of Patagonia, and arrived on the 27th November at Port Desire. He found there an immense quantity of dogfish, very large, and so strong that 4 men could with difficulty kill them, and numbers of birds, which having no wings could not fly, and which fed upon fish. They are classed under the general names of auks and penguins. In this very secure harbour, the ships were drawn up on shore to be repaired. During his stay at this place, Cavendish had some skirmishes with the Patagonians, men of gigantic size, and having feet 18 inches long, who wounded 2 of the sailors with arrows tipped with sharpened flints. On the 7th January 1587, Cavendish entered the Strait of Magellan, and in the narrowest part of it received on board his ships 21 Spaniards and 2 women, the sole survivors of the colony founded 3 years previously under the name Philippeville by Captain Sarmiento. This town, which had been built to bar the passage through the strait, had possessed no fewer than 4 forts, as well as several churches. Cavendish could discern the fortress then deserted and already falling into ruins. Its inhabitants, who had been completely prevented by the continual attacks of the savages from gathering in their harvests, had died of hunger, or had perished in endeavouring to reach the Spanish settlements in Chile. The admiral, upon hearing this lamentable tale, changed the name of Philippeville into that of Port Famine, under which appellation the place is known at the present day. On the 21st the ships entered a beautiful bay, which received the name of Elizabeth, and in which was buried the carpenter of the Hugh Gallant. Not far from thence a fine river fell into the sea, on the banks of which dwelt the anthropophagi, who had fought so fiercely with the Spaniards, and who endeavoured, but in vain, to entice the Englishmen into the interior of the country. On the 24th February, as the little squadron came forth from the strait, it encountered a violent storm, which dispersed it. The Hugh Gallant left alone, and letting in water in all directions, was only kept afloat with the greatest trouble. Rejoined on the 15th by his consorts, Cavendish tried in vain to land on Mocha Island, where Drake had been so maltreated by the Araucanians. This country, rich in gold and silver, had hitherto successfully resisted all Spanish attempts to subjugate it, and its inhabitants, fully determined to maintain their liberty, repulsed by force of arms every attempt to land. It was necessary, therefore, to go to the island of St. Maria, where the Indians, who took the Englishmen for Spaniards, furnished them with abundance of maize, fowls, sweet potatoes, pigs, and other provisions. On the 30th March Cavendish dropped anchor in 32 degrees 50 minutes in the Bay of Quintero. A party of 30 musketeers advanced into the country and met with oxen, cows, wild horses, hares, and partridges in abundance. The little troop was attacked by the Spaniards, and Cavendish was obliged to return to his ships after losing 12 of his men. He afterwards ravaged, plundered, or burnt the towns of Paraca, Cincha, Pisca, and Paita, and devastated the island of Puna, where he obtained a booty in coined money of the value of £25,760. After having scuttled the Hugh Gallant, which was totally unfit any longer to keep the water, Cavendish continued his profitable cruising, burnt, in the latitude of New Spain, a ship of 120 tons, plundered and burnt Aguatulio, and captured, after 6 hours of fighting, a vessel of 708 tons, laden with rich stuffs, and with 122,000 gold pesos. Then, victorious and contented, Cavendish wished to secure the great spoils which he was conveying against any chance of danger. He touched at the Ladrones, the Philippines, and Greater Java, doubled the Cape of Good Hope, recruited himself at St. Helena, and on the 9th September, 1588, anchored at Plymouth. After 2 years of sailing, privateering, and fighting, at the end of 2 years after his return, of all the great fortune which he had brought back with him, there remained only a sum sufficient for the fitting out of a third, and as it proved, a last expedition. Cavendish started on the 6th August 1591, with 5 vessels, but a storm on the coast of Patagonia scattered the flotilla, which could not be collected again until the arrival at Port Desire. Assailed by fearful hurricanes in the Strait of Magellan, Cavendish was obliged to go back, after having seen himself deserted by 3 of his ships. The want of fresh provisions, the cold, and the privations of all kinds which he underwent, and which had decimated his crew, forced him to return northwards along the coast of Brazil, where the Portuguese opposed every attempt at landing. He was therefore obliged to put to sea again, without having been able to revictual. Cavendish died, from grief, perhaps, as much as from hardships, before he reached the English coast. End of second part, Chapter 4, Part 1. Recording by Stephen Reynolds, Durham, Connecticut. Section 39 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Reynolds. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 4, Part 2. 1 year after the return of the companions of Barentz, 2 ships, the Mauritius and the Hendrik Frederick, with 2 yachts, the Eendracht and Esperance, having on board a crew of 248 men, quitted Amsterdam on the 2nd July, 1598. The commander-in-chief of this squadron was Oliver de Noort, a man at that time about 30 or thereabouts, and well known as having made several long cruising voyages. His second-in-command and vice-admiral was Jacob Claes d'Ulpenda, and as pilot there was a certain Melis, a skilful sailor of English origin. This expedition, fitted out by the merchants of Amsterdam, with the concurrence and aid of the States General of Holland, had a double purpose, at once commercial and military. Formerly, the Dutch had contented themselves with fetching from Portugal the merchandise which they distributed by means of their coasting vessels throughout Europe. But now they were reduced to the necessity of going to seek the commodities in the scene of their production. For this object, de Noort was to show his countrymen the route inaugurated by Magellan, and on the way to inflict as much injury as he could upon the Spaniards and Portuguese. At this period Philip II, whose yoke the Dutch had shaken off, and who had just added Portugal to his possessions, had forbidden his subjects to have any commercial intercourse with the rebels of the Low Countries. It was thus a necessity for Holland, if she did not wish to be ruined, and as a consequence to fall anew under Spanish rule, to open up for herself a road to the Spice Islands. The route which was the least frequented by the enemy's ships was that by the Strait of Magellan, and this was the one which De Noort was ordered to follow. After touching at Goree, the Dutch anchored in the Gulf of Guinea, at the island do Principe. Here the Portuguese pretended to give a friendly welcome to the men who went on shore, but they took advantage of a favourable opportunity to fall upon and massacre them without mercy. Among the dead were Corneille de Noort, brother of the admiral, Melis, Daniel Goertz, and John de Bremen, the captain, Peter Essius, being the only man who escaped it. It was a sorrowful commencement for a campaign, a sad presage which was destined not to remain unfulfilled. De Noort, who was furious over this foul play, landed from his ships 120 men, but he found the Portuguese so well entrenched that after a brisk skirmish, in which 17 more of his men were either killed or wounded, he was obliged to weigh anchor, without having been able to avenge the wicked and cowardly perfidy to which his brother and 12 of his companions had fallen victim. On the 25th December, one of the pilots, named Jan Volkers, was abandoned on the African coast as a punishment for his disloyal intrigues, for endeavouring to foment a spirit of despondency amongst the crews, and for his well-proved rebellion. On the 5th January, the island of Annobon, situated in the Gulf of Guinea, a little below the line, was sighted, and the course of the ships was changed for crossing the Atlantic. De Noort had scarcely cast anchor in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro before he sent some sailors on shore to obtain water and buy provisions from the natives. But the Portuguese opposed the landing, and killed 11 men. Afterwards, repulsed from the coast of Brazil by the Portuguese and the natives, driven back by contrary winds, having made vain efforts to reach the island of St. Helena, where they had hoped to obtain the provisions for which they were in the most pressing want, the Dutchmen, deprived of their pilot, toss at random upon the ocean. They land upon the desert islands of Martin Vaz, again reach the coast of Brazil at Rio Doce, which they mistake for Ascension Island, and are finally obliged to winter in the desert island of Santa Clara. The putting into port at this place was marked by several disagreeable events. The flagship struck upon a rock with so much violence that had the sea been a little rougher, she must have been lost. There were also some bloody and barbarous executions of mutinous sailors, notably that of a poor man, who having wounded a pilot with a knife thrust, was condemned to have his hand nailed to the mainmast. The invalids, of whom there were many on board the fleet, were brought on shore, and nearly all were cured by the end of a fortnight. From the 2nd to the 21st of June, De Noort remained in the island, which was not more than 3 miles from the mainland. But before putting to sea he was obliged to burn the Eendracht, for he had not sufficient men to work her. It was not until the 20th December, after having been tried by many storms, that he was able to cast anchor in Port Desire, where the crew killed in a few days a quantity of dogfish and sea lions, as well as more than 5,000 penguins. The general landed, said the French translation of De Noort's narrative, published by Drury, with a party of armed men, but they saw nobody, only some graves placed on high situations among the rocks, in which the people bury their dead, putting upon the grave a great quantity of stones, all painted red, having besides adorned the graves with darts, plumes of feathers, and other singular articles which they use as arms. The Dutch saw also, but at too great a distance to shoot them, buffaloes, stags, and ostriches, and from a single nest they obtained 10 ostrich eggs. Captain Jacob Jeans Huy de Cooper died during the stay at this place, and was interred at Port Desire. On the 23rd November, the fleet entered the Strait of Magellan. During a visit to the shore, 3 Dutchmen were killed by some Patagonians, and their death was avenged by the massacre of a whole tribe of Enoos. The long navigation through the Narrows and the lakes of the Strait of Magellan was signalized by the meeting with 2 Dutch ships under the command of Sebald de Weert, who had wintered not far from the Bay of Mauritius. and by the abandoning of Vice Admiral Claaz, who, as it would appear, had been several times guilty of insubordination. Are not these the acts which we see so frequently committed by English, Dutch, and Spanish navigators, a true sign of the times? A deed which we should now regard nowadays as one of terrible barbarity seemed doubtless a relatively mild punishment in the eyes of men so accustomed to set but little value upon human life. Nevertheless, could anything be more cruel than to abandon a man in a desert country, without arms and without provisions, to put him on shore in a country peopled by ferocious cannibals prepared to make a repast on his flesh? What was it but condemning him to a horrible death? On the 29th of February, 1600, De Noort, after having been 99 days in passing through the strait, came out onto the Pacific Ocean. A fortnight later a storm separated him from the Hendrik Frederick, which was never again heard of. As for De Noort, who had now with him only one yacht besides his own vessel, he cast anchor at the island of Mocha, and unlike the experience of his predecessors, he was very well received by the natives. Afterwards he sailed along the coast of Chile, where he was able to obtain provisions in abundance in exchange for Nuremberg knives, hatchets, shirts, hats, and other articles of no great value. After ravaging, plundering, and burning several towns on the Peruvian coast, after sinking all the vessels that he met with, and amassing a considerable booty, De Noort, hearing that a squadron commanded by the brother of the Viceroy Don Luis de Velasco had been sent in pursuit of him, judged it time to make for the Ladrone Islands, where he anchored on the 16th of September. The inhabitants came around our ship with more than 200 canoes, there being 3, 4, or 5 men in each canoe, crying out all together, "Hierro, hierro," iron, iron, which is greatly in request among them. They are as much at home in the water as upon land, and are very clever divers, as we perceived when we threw 5 pieces of iron into the sea, which a single man went out to search for. De Noort could testify unfortunately that these islands well deserved their name. The islanders tried even to drag the nails out of the ship, and carried off everything upon which they could lay their hands. One of them, having succeeded in climbing along a part of the rigging, had the audacity to enter a cabin and seize upon a sword, with which he threw himself into the sea. On the 14th October following, De Noort traversed the Philippine archipelago, where he made several descents, and burned, plundered, or sunk a number of Spanish or Portuguese vessels, and some Chinese junks. While cruising the Strait of Manila, he was attacked by 2 large Spanish vessels, and in the battle which followed, the Dutch had 5 men killed and 25 wounded, and lost the brigantine, which was captured with her crew of 25 men. The Spaniards lost more than 200 men, for their flagship caught fire and sank. Far from picking up the wounded, and the able-bodied men, who were trying to save themselves by swimming, the Dutch, making way with sails set on the foremast, across the heads which were to be seen in the water, pierced some with lances, and also discharged their cannon over them. After this bloody and fruitless victory, De Noort went to recruit at Borneo, captured a rich cargo of spices at Java, and having doubled the Cape of Good Hope, landed at Rotterdam on the 26th of August, having only 1 ship and 48 men remaining. If the merchants who had defrayed the expenses of the expedition approved of the conduct of De Noort, who brought back a cargo which more than reimbursed them for their expenditure, and who had taught his countrymen the way to the Indies, it behoves us, while extolling his qualities as a sailor, to take great exception to the manner in which he exercised the command, and to mete out severe blame for the barbarity which has left a stain of blood upon the first Dutch voyage of circumnavigation. We have now to speak of a man who, endowed with eminent qualities and with at least equal defects, carried on his life's work in divers, sometimes even in opposing directions, and who, after having reached the highest summit of honour to which a gentleman could aspire, at last laid his head upon a scaffold, accused of treason and felony. This man is Sir Walter Raleigh. If he have any claim to a place in this portrait gallery of great sailors, it is neither as founder of any English colony, nor as a sailor. It is as a discoverer, and what we have to say of him is not to his credit. Walter Raleigh passed 5 years in France, fighting against the League, in the midst of all those Gascons who formed the basis of the armies of Henry of Navarre, and in such society he perfected the habits of boasting and falsehood which belonged to his character. In 1577, after a campaign in the Low Countries against the Spaniards, he returns to England and takes a deep interest in the questions so passionately debated among his 3 brothers by his mother's side, John, Humphrey, and Adrian Gilbert. At this period, England was passing through a very grave economic crisis. The practice of agriculture was undergoing a transformation in all directions. Grazing was being substituted for tillage, and the number of agricultural labourers was greatly reduced by the change. From thence arose general distress, and also such a surplusage of population as was fast becoming a matter of anxious concern. At the same time, to long wars succeeds a peace, destined to endure throughout the reign of Elizabeth, so that a great number of adventurers know not how to find indulgence for their love of violent emotions. At this moment, therefore, arises the necessity for such an emigration as may relieve the country of its population, may permit all the miserable people dying of hunger to provide for their own wants in a new country, and by that means may increase the influence and prosperity of the mother country. All the more thoughtful minds of England, who follow the course of public opinion, Hakluyt, Thomas Hariot, Carlyle, Peckham, and the brothers Gilbert, are struck with this need. But it is to the last name that belongs the credit of indicating the locality suitable for the establishing of colonies. Raleigh only joined with his brothers in the scheme, following their lead, but he neither conceived nor began the carrying into execution, as he has been too often credited with doing, of this fruitful project, the colonization of the American shores of the Atlantic. If Raleigh, all-powerful with Queen Elizabeth, fickle and nevertheless jealous in her affections, as she was, encourage his brothers, if he expend himself £40,000 sterling in his attempts at colonization, he still takes good care not to quit England, for the life of patience and self-devotion of the founder of a colony would have no attractions for him. He gives up and sells his patent as soon as he perceives the inutility of his efforts, while he does not forget to reserve for himself the 5th part of any profit arising eventually from the colony. At the same time, Raleigh fits out some vessels against the Spanish possessions, and himself soon takes part in the strife and the battles which saved England from the invincible Armada, afterwards proceeding to support the claims of the Prior de Crato on the throne of Portugal. It is a short time after his return to England that he falls into disgrace with his royal mistress, and after his release from prison, while he is confined to his princely mansion in Sherborne, he conceives the project of his voyage to Guiana. To his mind, this is a gigantic enterprise, of which the marvellous results are destined to draw upon him the attention of the whole world, and to restore to him the favour of his sovereign. Would not the discovery and conquest of El Dorado, of the country in which, according to Orellana, the temples are roofed with plates of gold, where all the tools, even those for the meanest purposes, are made of gold, where one walks upon precious stones, procure for him greater glory, these are the very words which Raleigh employs in his account, than Cortes had gained in Mexico or Pizarro in Peru. He will have under him more golden towns and nations than the King of Spain, the Sultan of the Turks, and no matter what emperor. We have already spoken of the fables which Orellana had invented in 1539, and which had been the fruitful source of more than one legend. Humboldt discloses what had given them birth when he describes to us the nature of the soil and the rocks which surround Lake Parima, between the Essequibo and Branco. They are, says this great traveller, rocks of micaceous slate, and of sparkling talc, which are resplendent in the midst of a sheet of water, which acts as a reflector beneath the burning tropical sun. So are explained those massive domes of gold, those obelisks of silver, and all those marvels of which the boastful and enthusiastic minds of the Spaniards afforded them a glimpse. Did Raleigh really believe in the existence of this city of gold, for the conquest of which he was about to sacrifice so many lives? Was he thoroughly convinced himself, or did he not yield to the illusions of a mind eager for glory? It is impossible to say, but this at least is indisputable. that, to borrow from the just expressions of M. Philaret Chasles, at the moment even of his embarkation, men did not believe in his promises. They were suspicious of his exaggerations, and dreaded the results of an expedition directed by a man so foolhardy and of a morality so equivocal. Nevertheless, it seemed that Raleigh had foreseen everything needful for this undertaking, and that he had made the necessary studies. Not only did he speak of the nature of the soil of Guiana, of its productions and its inhabitants with imperturbable assurance, but he had taken care to send, at his own expense, a ship commanded by Captain Whiddon, to prepare the way for the fleet which he intended to conduct in person to the banks of the Orinoco. What he took good care, however, not to confide to the public, was that all the information he received from his emissary was unfavourable to the enterprise. Raleigh himself started from Plymouth on the 9th February, 1595, with a small fleet of 5 vessels and 100 soldiers, without reckoning marines, officers, and volunteers. After stopping 4 days at Fortaventura, one of the Canaries, to take in wood and water there, he reached Teneriffe, where Captain Brereton ought to have rejoined him. Having waited for him in vain for 80 days, Raleigh sailed for Trinidad, where he met Whiddon. The island of Trinidad was at that time governed by Don Antonio de Berreo, who, it is said, had obtained accurate information concerning Guiana. The arrival of the English did not please him, and he immediately despatched emissaries to Cumana and to Margarita, with orders to gather together the troops to attack the Englishmen, while at the same time he forbade any Indians or Spaniards to hold intercourse with them under pain of death. Raleigh, forewarned, determined to be beforehand with him. At nightfall he landed in secret with 100 men, captured the town of St. Joseph, to which the Indians set fire, without a blow, and carried off Berreo and the principal personages to the ships. At the same time arrived Captains Gifford and Ninin, from whom he had been separated upon the Spanish coasts. Raleigh at once sailed for the Orinoco, entered Capuri Bay with a large galley and 3 boats carrying 100 sailors and soldiers, became entangled in the inextricable labyrinth of islands and canals which form the mouth of the river, and ascended the Orinoco for a distance of 330 miles. The account which Raleigh gives of his campaign is so fabulous, with the coolness of a Gascon transported to the banks of the Thames. He so heaps one falsehood upon the top of another, that one is almost tempted to class his narrative amongst the number of imaginary voyages. He says that some Spaniards who had seen the town of Manoa, called El Dorado, told him that this town exceeds in size and wealth all the towns in the world, and everything which the conquistadores had seen in America. There is no winter there, he says, a soil dry and fertile, with game and birds of every species in great abundance, who filled the air with hitherto unknown notes. It was a real concert for us. My captain, sent to search for mines, perceived veins both of gold and silver, but as he had no tool but his sword, he was unable to detach these metals to examine them in detail. However, he carried away several bits of them, which he reserved for future examination. A Spaniard of Caracas called this mine Madre del Oro, Mother of Gold. Then, as Raleigh well knows that the public is on its guard against his exaggerations, he adds, "It will be thought perchance that I am the sport of a false and cheating delusion. But why should I have undertaken a voyage thus laborious if I had not entertained the conviction that there is not a country upon earth which is richer in gold than Guiana? Whiddon and Milleshap, our surgeons, brought back several stones which resembled sapphires. I showed these stones to several inhabitants of Orinoco, who have assured me that there exists an entire mountain of them." An old cacique of the age of 110, who nevertheless could walk 10 miles without fatigue, came to see Raleigh, boasted to him of the formidable power of the Emperor of Manoa, and proved to him that his forces were insufficient. He depicted these peoples as much civilized, as wearing clothes and possessing great riches, especially in plates of gold. Finally, he spoke to him of a mountain of pure gold. Raleigh relates that he wished to approach this mountain, but, sad mischance, it was at that moment half submerged. It had the form of a tower, and appeared to me rather white than yellow. A torrent, which precipitated itself from the mountain, swollen by the rains, made a tremendous noise which could be heard at the distance of many miles, and which deafened our people. I recollected the description which Berreo had given of the brilliancy of the diamonds, and of the other precious stones scattered over the various parts of the country. I had, however, some doubts as to the value of these stones. Their extraordinary whiteness nevertheless surprised me. After a short time of repose on the banks of the Vinicapara, and a visit to the village of the cacique, the latter promised to conduct me to the foot of the mountain by a circuitous route. But at the sight of the numerous difficulties which presented themselves, I preferred to return to the mouth of the Cumana, where the caciques of the neighbourhood came to bring various presents, consisting of the rare productions of the country. We will spare the reader the description of people 3 times taller than ordinary men, of cyclops, of natives who had their eyes upon their shoulders, their mouths in their chest, and the hair growing from the middle of the back, all affirmations seriously related, but which give to Raleigh's narrative a singular resemblance to a fairy tale. One fancies while reading it, it must be a page taken out of the 1001 Nights. If we put on one side all these figments of an imagination run mad, what gain has been derived for geography? There was certainly no pains spared in announcing with much noise, and very great puffing, this fantastic expedition, and we may well say, with the fable writer, "In fancy free, I an author see, who says, the awful war I'll sing, of Titans with the Thunder King. Of this grand promise the result we find is often wind." End of second part, Chapter 4, Part 2. Recording by Stephen Reynolds, Durham, Connecticut.
Section 40 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 5, Part 1. Missionaries and Settlers, Merchants and Tourists. The 17th century has a distinctive character of its own, differing from that of the preceding century in the fact that nearly all the great discoveries have been already made, and that the work of this whole period consists almost exclusively in perfecting the information already acquired. It contrasts equally with the century which is to succeed it, because scientific methods are not yet applied by astronomers and sailors as they are to be 100 years later. It appears, in fact, that the narratives of the first explorers, who were only able, so to speak, to obtain a glimpse of the regions which they traversed while waging their wars, may have in some degree exercised a baneful influence upon the public mind. Curiosity, in the narrowest sense of the word, is carried to an extreme. Men travel over the world to gain an idea of the manners and customs of each nation, of the productions and manufactures of each country, but there is no real study. They do not seek to trace what they see to its source, and to reason scientifically upon the why and wherefore of the facts. They behold, curiosity is satisfied, and they pass on. The observations made do not penetrate beneath the surface, and the great object appears to be to visit, as rapidly as may be, all the regions which the 16th century has brought to light. Besides, the abundance of the wealth diffused on a sudden over the whole of Europe has caused an economic crisis. Commerce, like industry, is transformed and altered. New ways are opened, new mediums arise, new wants are created, luxury increases, and the eagerness to make a fortune rapidly by speculation turns the heads of many. If Venice, from a commercial point of view, be dead, the Dutch are about to constitute themselves, to use a happy expression of M. Leroy Beaulieu, the carriers and agents of Europe, and the English are preparing to lay the foundations of their vast colonial empire. To the merchants succeed the missionaries. They alight in large numbers upon the newly discovered countries, preaching the gospel, civilizing the barbarous nations, studying and describing the country. The development of apostolic zeal is one of the dominant features of the 17th century, and it behoves us to recognize all that geography and historic science owe to these devoted, learned, and unassuming men. The traveler only passes through a country, the missionary dwells in it. The latter has evidently much greater facilities for acquiring an intimate knowledge of the history and civilization of the nations which he studies. It is therefore very natural that we should owe to them narratives of journeys, descriptions, and histories which are still consulted with advantage, and which have served as a basis for later works. If there be any country to which these reflections more particularly apply, it is to Africa, and especially to Abyssinia. How much of this vast triangular continent of Africa was known in the 17th century? Nothing but the coasts, it will be said. A mistake. From the earliest times, the two branches of the Nile, the Astapus and the Bahr al Abiad, had been known to the ancients. They had even advanced, if the lists of countries and nations discovered at Karnak by M. Mariette may be believed, as far as the great lakes of the interior. In the 12th century, the Arab geographer Edrisi writes an excellent description of Africa for Roger II of Sicily, and confirms these data. Later on, Cadamosto and Ibn Battuta travel over Africa, and the latter goes as far as Timbuktu. Marco Polo affirms that Africa is only united to Asia by the Isthmus of Suez, and he visits Madagascar. Lastly, when the Portuguese, led by Vasco da Gama, have completed the circumnavigation of Africa, some of them remain in Abyssinia, and in a short time diplomatic relations are established between that country and Portugal. We have already said something of Francesco Alvarez. In his train, several Portuguese missionaries settle in the country, amongst whom must be named Fathers Paes and Lobo. Father Paes left Goa in 1588 to preach Christianity upon the eastern coast of North Africa. After long and sad mishaps, he landed at Massawa in Abyssinia, traversed the country, and in 1618 pushed on as far as the sources of the Blue Nile, a discovery the authenticity of which Bruce was hereafter to dispute, but of which the narrative differs only in some unimportant particulars from that of the Scotch traveller. In 1604, Paes, arrived at the court of the King Za-Denghel, had preached with such success that he had converted the king and all his court. He had even soon acquired so great an influence over the Abyssinian monarch that the latter, in writing to the Pope and to the King of Spain to offer them his friendship, asked them to send him men fitted to teach his people. Father Geronimo Lobo landed in Abyssinia with Alfonso Meneses, Patriarch of Ethiopia, in 1625. But times were greatly changed. The king converted by Paes had been murdered, and his successor, who had summoned the Portuguese missionaries, died after a short time. A violent revulsion of feeling ensued against the Christians, and the missionaries were driven away, imprisoned, or given up to the Turks. Lobo was charged with the mission of obtaining the sum necessary for the ransom of his companions. After many wanderings which led him to Brazil, Cartagena, Cadiz, and Seville, to Lisbon and to Rome, where he gave the Pope and the King of Spain numerous and accurate details upon the Church of Ethiopia and the manners of the inhabitants, he made a last journey in India, and returned to Lisbon to die in 1678. Christianity had been introduced into Congo upon the Atlantic coast in 1489, the year of its discovery by the Portuguese. At first Dominicans were sent, but as they made scarce any progress, the Pope, with the consent of the King of Portugal, dispatched thither some Italian Capuchins. These were Carli de Placenza in 1667, Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi from 1654 to 1668, afterwards Antonio Zucchelli and Gradisca from 1696 to 1704. We shall mention these missionaries only because they have published accounts of their journeys. Cavazzi explored in succession Angola, the country of Matumba, and the islands of Coanza and Loana. In the ardour of his apostolic zeal, he could devise no better means of converting the blacks than by burning their idols, rebuking the kings for the time-honoured custom of polygamy, and subjecting to torture or to being torn with whips those who relapsed into idolatry. Notwithstanding all this, he gained considerable ascendancy over the natives, which, if it had been well directed, might have produced very useful results in the development of civilization and the progress of religion. The same reproach is due also to Father Zucchelli and to the other missionaries in Congo. The narrative of Cavazzi, published at Rome in 1687, asserted that Portuguese influence extended from 200 to 300 miles from the coast, and that in the interior there existed a very important town, known by the name of San Salvador, which possessed 12 churches, a Jesuit college, and a population of 50,000 souls. At the close of the 14th century, Pigafetta published the account of the journey of Duarte Lopez, ambassador from the King of Congo to the courts of Rome and Lisbon. A map which accompanies this narrative presents to us a Lake Zambre, in the very place occupied by Lake Tanganyika, and more to the west, Lake Aqualunda, from whence issued the Congo River. South of the equator, 2 lakes are indicated, one the Lake of the Nile, the other, more to the east, bears the name of Koloe. They appear to be the Albert and the Victoria Nyanza. This most curious information was rejected by the geographers of the 19th century, who left blank the whole interior of Africa. Upon the west coast of Africa, at the mouth of the Senegal, the French had established settlements which, under the skilful administration of Andrew Brew, speedily received considerable extension. Brouin, commandant for the king and director general of the Royal French Company upon the Senegal coast and in other parts of Africa, so ran his official title, although he may be little known, and the article which treats of him may be one of the most curtailed in the great collections of biography, deserves to occupy one of the most prominent positions among colonizers and explorers. Not content with extending the colony as far as its present limits, he explored countries which have been only lately revisited by Lieutenant Mage, or which have not been visited at all since Brewer's time. He carried the French outposts eastwards above the junction of the Senegal and the Falémé, northwards as far as Arguin, which we have since abandoned, although reserving our rights, and southwards as far as the island of Bissau. He explored in the interior Galam and Bambouk, so rich in gold, and collected the earliest documents concerning the Pools, Peuls or Fools, the Yolofs and the Mussulmen, who, coming from the north, attempted the religious conquest of all the black nations of the country. The information thus collected by Brewer about the history and migrations of these various people is of the greatest value, affording clear light, even in the present day, to the geographer and the historian. Not only has Brewer left us the narrative of deeds of which he was witness, and the description of the places which he visited, but we also owe to him much information about the productions of the countries, the plants, the animals, and all the objects which would give occasion for commercial or industrial enterprise. These most curious documents, put together very maladroitly, it must be confessed, by Father Labat, formed the subject a few years ago of a very interesting work by M. Baliou. To the southeast of Africa, during the first half of the 17th century, the French founded some commercial settlements in Madagascar, an island long known under the name of St. Lawrence. They built Fort Dauphin, under the administration of M. de Flacourt. Several unknown districts of the island are explored, as well as the neighbouring islands upon the coast. The Mascarene Islands are occupied in 1649. Although firm and moderate towards his countrymen, de Flacourt did not use the same self-control towards the natives. He even brought about a general revolt, as a consequence of which he was recalled. Expeditions into the interior of Madagascar were henceforth very rare, and it is not until the present day that we find a thorough exploration carried out. Of Indochina and Tibet, the only information which reached Europe during the whole of the 17th century was due to the missionaries. Such names as Father Alexandre de Rhodes, Ant d'Andrada, Avril, Benedict Goes, may not be passed over in silence. In their annual letters is to be found a quantity of information which even in the present day retains a real interest as concerning regions so long closed against Europeans. In Cochin China and Tonkin, Father Tachard devoted himself to astronomical observations, of which the result was to prove by the most conclusive evidence the great errors in the longitudes given by Ptolemy. This called the attention of the learned world to the necessity of a reform in the graphic representation of the countries of the extreme East, and for attaining this end, to the absolute need of close observations made by specially qualified scientific men, or by navigators familiar with astronomical calculations. The country which specially attracted the missionaries was China, that enormous and populous empire which ever since the arrival of Europeans in India had persevered with the greatest strictness in the absurd policy of abstention from any intercourse whatsoever with foreigners. It was not until the close of the 16th century that the missionaries obtained the permission, so often demanded before in vain, to penetrate into the Middle Empire. Their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy facilitated their settlement and enabled them to gather, as well from the ancient annals of the country as during their journeys, a prodigious quantity of most valuable information concerning the history, ethnography, and geography of the Celestial Empire. Fathers Mendoza, Ricci, Trigault, Visdelou, Lecomte, Verbiest, Navarrete, Chasles, and Martini deserve a special mention for having carried to China the arts and sciences of Europe, while they diffused in the West the first accurate and precise information upon the unprogressive civilization of the flowery land. End of section 40. Section 41 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 5, Part 2a. Missionaries and Settlers, Merchants and Tourists. The Dutch were not slow in perceiving the weakness and decadence of the Portuguese power in Asia. They felt with how much ease a clever and prudent nation might in a short time become possessed of the whole commerce of the extreme East. After a considerable number of private expeditions and voyages of reconnaissance, they had founded in 1602 that celebrated Company of the Indies, which was destined to raise to so high a pitch the wealth and prosperity of the metropolis. Equally in its strife with the Portuguese as in its dealing with the natives, the company pursued a very skilful policy of moderation. Far from founding colonies or repairing and occupying the fortresses which they took from the Portuguese, the Dutch bore themselves as simple traders, exclusively occupied with their commerce. They avoided building any fortified factory, except at the intersection of the great commercial roads. Thus they were able in a short time to seize all the carrying trade between India, China, Japan, and Oceania. The one fault committed by the all-powerful company was the concentrating in its own hands a monopoly of the trade in spices. It drove away the foreigners who had settled in the Moluccas or in the islands of Sunda, or who came thither to obtain a cargo of spices. It even went the length, in order to raise the price of this valuable commodity, of prescribing the cultivation of certain species in a large number of islands, and of forbidding, under pain of death, the exportation and sale of seeds and cuttings of the spice-producing trees. In a few years the Dutch were established in Java, Sumatra, Borneo, the Moluccas, and at the Cape of Good Hope, harbours the best placed for ships returning to Europe. It was at this time that a rich merchant of Amsterdam, Jacob Lemaire, in concert with a skilful mariner named Wilhelm Cornelis Schouten, conceived a project for reaching the Indies by a new route. The Dutch States General had in fact forbidden any subject of the United Provinces not in the pay of the Company of the Indies from going to the Spice Islands by way of the Cape of Good Hope or of the Strait of Magellan. Schouten, according to some, Lemaire, according to others, had formed the idea of eluding this interdict by seeking a passage to the south of Magellan's Strait. This much is certain, that Lemaire bore one half of the expense of the expedition, while Schouten, by the aid of several merchants whose names have been handed down to us, and who filled the chief offices in the town of Hoorn, provided the other half. They fitted out the Concorde, a vessel of 360 tons, and a yacht, carrying together a crew of 65 men and 29 cannon. This was certainly an equipment but little in accordance with the magnitude of the enterprise. But Schouten was a skilful mariner, the crew had been carefully chosen, and the vessels were abundantly furnished with provisions and spare rigging. Le Maire was commissioner, and Schouten the captain of the ship. The destination was kept secret, and officers and crew entered into an unlimited engagement to go wherever they might be led. On the 25th June, 1615, 11 days after quitting the Texel, and when there was no longer anything to be feared from indiscretion, the crews were assembled to listen to the reading of an order which ran as follows: "The 2 vessels would seek another passage than that of Magellan, by which to enter the South Sea, and to discover there certain southern countries, in the hope of obtaining enormous profits from them, and if Heaven should not favour this design, they would repair by means of the same sea to the East Indies." This declaration was received with enthusiasm by the whole crew, who were animated, like all Dutchmen of that period, with a love for great discoveries. The route then usually pursued for reaching South America, as may perhaps have been already observed, followed the African coasts as far as below the equator. The Concorde did not try to deviate from it. She reached the shores of Brazil, Patagonia, and Port Desire at 300 miles to the north of the Strait of Magellan, but was for several days hindered by storms from entering the harbour. The yacht even remained for the space of 1 whole tide aground and lying on her side, but high water set her afloat again. Only for a short time, however, for whilst some repairs were being done to her keel, her rigging took fire, and she was consumed, in spite of the energetic efforts of the 2 crews. On the 13th January 1616, Le Maire and Schouten arrived at the Sebaldine Islands, discovered by Sebald de Weert, and followed the coast of Tierra del Fuego at a short distance from land. The coast ran east quarter southeast, and was skirted by high mountains covered with snow. On the 21st of January at midday they sighted its extreme point, but eastward stretched some more land, which also appeared to be of great elevation. The distance between these 2 islands, according to the general opinion, appeared to be about 24 miles, and Schouten entered the strait which divided them. It was so encumbered with whales that the ship was obliged to tack more than once to avoid them. The island to the east received the name of Staten Island, and that to the west the name of Maurice of Nassau. 24 hours after entering this strait, which received the name of Le Maire, the ship emerged from it, and to an archipelago of small islands situated to starboard was given the name of Barneveld, in honour of the Grand Pensionary of Holland. In 58 degrees Le Maire doubled Cape Horn, so named in remembrance of the town where the expedition had been fitted out, and entered the South Sea. Le Maire afterwards went northwards as far as the parallel of the Juan Fernandez Islands, where he judged it wise to stop, in order to recruit his men who were suffering from scurvy. As Magellan had done, Le Maire and Schouten passed without perceiving them amongst the principal Polynesian archipelagos, and cast anchor on the 10th April at the Island of Dogs, where it was only possible to procure a little fresh water and some herbs. They hoped to reach the Solomon Islands, but in the north the dangerous archipelago was entered, in which were discovered Waterland Island, so named on account of its containing a great lake, and Fly Island, because a cloud of these insects settled upon the vessel, and it was impossible to get rid of them until at the end of 4 days there was a change of wind. Afterwards Le Maire crossed the Friendly Archipelago, and entered that of the Navigators, or of Samoa, of which 4 small islands still retain the names which were then given to them: Goed Hoep, Cocoa, Horn, and Traitors' Islands. The inhabitants of these parts showed themselves extremely addicted to stealing. They tried to draw out the bolts from the ship, and to break the chains. Scurvy continued to prevail among the crew, and it was therefore a great boon to receive from the king a present of a black boar and some fruits. The sovereign, who was named Latau, speedily arrived in a large canoe with sails, in shape like the Dutch sledges, traîneaux, escorted by a flotilla of 25 boats. The king did not venture himself to go on board the Concorde, but his son was of a bolder spirit, and inquired the reason of everything he saw with the most lively curiosity. The next day the number of canoes was greatly augmented, and the Dutch perceived by certain indications that an attack was impending. Accordingly, a shower of stones falls on a sudden upon the ship, the canoes approach nearer, become annoying, and the Dutch, to free themselves from them, are forced to resort to a discharge of musketry. This island was rightly named Traitors' Island. It was now the 18th of May, and Lemaire ordered the course to be changed, that the Moluccas might be reached by the north of New Guinea. He probably passed within sight of the Solomon Archipelago, the Admiralty Islands, and the Thousand Islands, Mille Îles, coasting afterwards along New Guinea from 143 degrees to Geelwink Bay. He frequently landed, and gave names to a number of points. The 25 islands which form a part of the Admiralty Archipelago, the High Corner, the High Mountain, Hoogberg, which seems to correspond to a portion of the neighbouring coast of Cornelis Kinnaert Bay, Moa and Arimoa, two islands again seen later on by Tasman, the island to which was given the name of Schouten, but which is now called Mysore, and which must not be confounded with some other Schouten Islands situated upon the coast of Guinea, but much farther to the west, and finally the Cape Goede Hoop, which appears to be Cape Saavedra at the western extremity of Mysore. After sighting the country of Papua, Schouten and Lemaire reached Gilolo, one of the Moluccas, where they received an eager welcome from their compatriots. When they were thoroughly rested from their fatigues and cured of scurvy, the Dutch went to Batavia, arriving there on the 23rd October 1616, only 13 months after quitting the Texel, and having lost only 13 men during the long voyage. But the Company of the Indies did not at all understand their privileges being infringed upon, and a possibility discovered of reaching the colonies by a way not foreseen in the letters patent which had been granted to the Company at the time of its establishment. The governor caused the Concorde to be seized, and arrested her officers and sailors, whom he sent off to Holland, there to be tried. Poor Lemaire, who had expected a totally different recompense for his toils and fatigues, and for the discoveries which he had made, could not bear up under the blow which had fallen so unexpectedly upon him. He fell ill of grief, and died in the latitude of the island of Mauritius. As for Schouten, he appears not to have been molested upon his return to his own country, and to have made several voyages to the Indies, which were not distinguished by any fresh discovery. He was returning to Europe in 1625, when he was forced by bad weather to enter Antongil Bay, upon the east coast of Madagascar, where he died. Such was the history of this important expedition, which by means of Strait Lemaire opened up a shorter and less dangerous route than that by Magellan's Strait, an expedition signalized by several discoveries in Oceania, and by a more attentive exploration of points already seen by Spanish or Portuguese navigators. But it is often a matter of difficulty to settle with accuracy to which of these nations the discovery of certain islands, countries, or archipelagos in the neighbourhood of Australia may be due. Since we are speaking of the Dutch, we shall put the chronological order of discoveries a little on one side, that we may relate as well as those of Mendana and Quiros the expeditions of Jan Abel Tasman. What was the early history of Tasman? By what concurrence of circumstances did he embrace the profession of a sailor? By what means did he acquire the nautical skill and science of which he gave so many proofs, and which conducted him to his important discoveries? From ignorance we cannot answer these questions. All we know of his biography commences with his departure from Batavia on 2nd June 1639. After passing the Philippines, he would seem during this first voyage to have visited in company with Matthew Quast the Bonin Islands, then known by the fantastic title of the Gold and Silver Islands. In his second expedition, composed of 2 vessels of which he had the chief command, and which sailed from Batavia on the 14th of August 1642, he reached the Mauritius on the 5th September, and afterwards sailed to the southeast, seeking for the Australian continent. On the 24th November, in latitude 42 degrees 25 seconds south, he discovered land, to which he gave the name of Van Diemen, after the governor of the Sunda Islands, but which is now with much greater justice called Tasmania. He anchored there in Frederik Hendrik Bay, and ascertained that the country was inhabited, although he could not see a single native. After following this coast for a certain time, he sailed eastwards, with the intention of afterwards making once more for the north, to reach the Solomon Archipelago. On the 13th December, in latitude 42 degrees 10 seconds, he came in sight of a mountainous country which he followed towards the north until the 18th December, when he cast anchor in a bay. But even the boldest of the savages whom he met with there did not approach the ship within a stone's throw. Their voices were rough, their stature tall, their colour brown inclining to yellow, and their black hair, which was nearly as long as that of the Japanese, was worn drawn up to the crown of the head. On the morrow they summoned courage to go on board one of the vessels and carry on traffic by means of barter. Tasman, upon seeing these pacific dispositions, dispatched a boat for the purpose of obtaining a more accurate knowledge of the shore. Of the sailors who manned it, 3 were killed without provocation by the natives, while the others escaped by swimming, and were picked up by the ship's boats. But by the time they were in readiness to fire upon the assailants, these had disappeared. The spot where this sad event happened received the name of Assassins' Moordenaars Bay. Tasman, who felt convinced that he could not carry on any intercourse with such fierce people, weighed anchor and sailed up the coast as far as its extreme point, which he named Cape Maria van Diemen, in honour of his lady, for a legend states that having had the audacity to pretend to the hand of the daughter of the governor of the East Indies, the latter had sent him to sea with 2 dilapidated ships, the Heemskerke and the Zegen. The land thus discovered received the name of Staten Land, soon changed into that of New Zealand. On the 21st January 1643, Tasman discovered the islands of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, upon which he found a great quantity of pigs, fowls, and fruit. On the 6th February, the ships entered an archipelago consisting of a score of islands, which were called Prince William Islands, and after sighting Antong Java, Tasman followed the coast of New Guinea from Cape Santa Maria, passed by the various points previously discovered by Lemaire and Schouten, and anchored off Batavia on the 15th June following, after a 10 months' voyage. In a second expedition, Tasman, in obedience to his orders dated 1664, was to visit Van Diemen's Land and to make a careful examination of the western coast of New Guinea, as far as 17 degrees south latitude, in order to ascertain whether that island belonged to the Australian continent. It does not appear that Tasman carried out this programme, but the loss of his journals causes complete uncertainty as to the route which he followed, and the discoveries which he may have made. From this time there is no record of the events which marked the close of his career, nor of the place and date of his death. From the period of the taking of Malacca by Albuquerque, the Portuguese conceived that a new world extended to the south of Asia. Their ideas were soon shared by the Spaniards, and henceforward a series of voyages were made on the Pacific Ocean to search for a southern continent, of which the existence appeared geographically necessary to counterbalance the immense extent of the lands already known. Java the Great, designated later by the names of New Holland and Australia, had been seen by the French perhaps, or as is more probable by Saavedra, from 1530 to 1540, and it was sought for by a crowd of navigators, amongst whom we may mention the Portuguese, Serrao and Meneses, and the Spaniards, Saavedra, Hernando de Grijalva, Alvarado, and Inigo Ortiz de Retes, who explored the greater part of the islands to the north of New Guinea, as well as that great island itself. Afterwards come Mendana, Torres, and Quiros, upon whose deeds we shall pause a little, on account of the importance and authenticity of the discoveries which we owe to them. Alvaro Mendana de Nera was nephew to the governor of Lima, Don Pedro de Castro, who warmly advocated with the home government his nephew's project of searching for new countries in the Pacific Ocean. Mendana was 21 when he took the command of 2 ships and 125 soldiers and sailors. He sailed from Callao, the port of Lima, on the 19th November 1567. After sighting the small island of Jesus, he discovered on the 7th February, between 7 degrees and 8 degrees south latitudes, the island of Santa Isabella, where the Spaniards built a brigantine, with which they explored the archipelago of which this island was a part. The inhabitants, says the narrative of a companion of Mendana, quote, are anthropophagi, They devour those whom they can make their prisoners in war, and even without being in open hostility, those whom they can succeed in taking by treachery." One of the chiefs in the islands sent to Mendana as a delicacy a quarter of a child, but the Spanish commander caused it to be buried in the presence of the natives, who appeared much hurt by an act which they could not understand. The Spaniards explored the island Las Palmas (Palm Island), Los Ramos, so named because it was discovered on Palm Sunday, Galley Island, and Buena Vista, of which the inhabitants, under the appearance of friendship, concealed hostile intentions which were not long in displaying themselves. The same reception awaited the Spaniards at the island San Dimas, at Cesarga, and at Guadalcanar, upon which ginger was found for the first time. In the return voyage to Santa Isabella, the Spaniards pursued a course which enabled them to discover St. George Island, where they found bats as large as kites. Scarcely had the crew of the brigantine cast anchor in the harbour of Santa Isabella than they were obliged again to weigh it, for the place was so unhealthy that 5 soldiers died and a great number of others were taken ill. Mendana stopped at the island of Guadalcanar, where out of 10 men who had landed to fetch water, 1 negro alone escaped from the attacks of the natives, who were extremely angry at one of their fellows having been carried off by the Spaniards. The punishment was terrible. 20 men were killed and a number of houses burned. Mendana afterwards visited several islands of the Solomon Archipelago, amongst others the 3 Marys and San Juan. Upon the latter island, whilst the ships were being repaired and caulked, several affrays with the natives occurred, in which some prisoners were made. After this chequered rest, Mendana again put to sea, and visited the islands of San Cristobal, Santa Catalina, and Santa Ana. But as by this time the number of invalids was considerable, the provisions and ammunition nearly exhausted, and the rigging become rotten, the flotilla now set out to return to Peru. The separation of the flagship, the discovery of certain islands which it is difficult to identify, and probably of the Sandwich Islands, violent storms during which the sails were carried away, the sickness caused by the insufficiency and putrefaction of the water and biscuit on board, were all incidents signalizing this long and trying return voyage, which was ended by the arrival of the ships at the port of Colima in California after 5 months of navigation. The narrative of Mendana excited no enthusiasm, in spite of the name of Solomon which he gave to the archipelago discovered by him, to make it believed that from thence came the treasures of the Jewish king. Marvellous recitals had no longer any fascination for men glutted with the riches of Peru. Proofs were what they demanded. The smallest nugget of gold or the least grain of silver would have been more satisfactory to them. Mendana had 27 years to wait before he was able to organize another expedition, but then his fleet was a large one, it being proposed to found a colony in the island of San Cristobal, which Alvaro de Mendana had seen during his first voyage. Thus 4 ships carrying nearly 400 people sailed from the port of Lima on the 11th April 1595. Among those on board may be named Doña Isabella, wife of Mendana, the 3 brothers-in-law of the general, and the pilot Pedro Fernandez Quiros, who later on distinguished himself as commander-in-chief of another expedition. The fleet did not finally leave the Peruvian coast, where its equipment had been completed, until the 16th April. At the end of a month's navigation, not distinguished by any remarkable incident, an island was discovered, which according to custom received the name of the saint whose day it was, and was called Magdalena. Immediately the fleet was surrounded by a crowd of canoes bearing more than 400 Indians, of fine stature and nearly white, and who, while presenting cocoanuts and other fruits to the sailors, appeared to entreat them to disembark. The natives no sooner came on board than they began to pilfer, and it was necessary to fire a cannon to get rid of them. A wound which one of the natives received in the fray soon changed their disposition, and a discharge of musketry was the reply to the shower of arrows which they let fly from their boats. Not far from this island 3 others were discovered, San Pedro, Dominica, and Santa Cristina, and the name of Las Marquesas de Mendoza was given to the group, in honour of the governor of Peru. So friendly had been the intercourse at the beginning, that an Indian woman, upon seeing the beautiful fair hair of Doña Isabella de Mendana, had begged her by signs to give her a curl of it. But, by the fault of the Spaniards, the mutual relations speedily became hostile, and so continued until the day when the natives, becoming conscious of the great inferiority of their arms, begged for peace. End of second part, chapter 5, part 2a. Section 42 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 5, Part 2b. On the 5th August, the Spanish flotilla again put to sea and made 1200 miles west-northwest. On the 20th August were discovered the St. Bernard, since called Dangerous Islands, and afterwards Queen Charlotte's Islands, upon which, notwithstanding the scarcity of provisions, no landing was made. After Solitary Island, a name which explains its situation, the Santa Cruz archipelago was reached. But at this time, during a storm, the flagship became separated from the fleet, and although search was made several times, no tidings of her were obtained. 50 canoes, carrying a crowd of natives of a tawny complexion or of a lustrous black, immediately approached the ships. Quote, "All had frizzled hair, black, red, or some other colour, for it was dyed. Their teeth also were dyed red. The head was half shaven, the body was naked, except a small veil of fine linen. The face and the arms painted black, glittering and striped with various colours, the neck and limbs loaded with several strings of small beads, of gold, or of black wood, of fishes' teeth, or of a species of metals made of mother of pearl, or of pearls." End quote. For arms they carried bows, poisoned arrows with sharp points hardened in the fire, or tipped with bone and steeped in the juice of a herb, great stones, heavy wooden swords made of stiff wood, with 3 harpoon points, each more than a handbreadth long. Slung over their shoulders they had haversacks exceedingly well made out of palm leaves, and filled with biscuits made from certain roots which served them for food. At first Mendana thought he recognized in these natives the inhabitants of the islands he was seeking, but he was quickly undeceived. The vessels were received with a shower of arrows, which was the more vexatious because Mendana, seeing that he could not find the Solomon Islands, had determined to establish his colony in this archipelago. At this juncture discord reigned among the Spaniards. A revolt fomented against the general was almost immediately suppressed, and the guilty were executed. But these sorrowful events and the fatigues of the voyage had so completely undermined the health of the head of the expedition that he died on the 17th October, after having had time to indicate his wife as his successor in the conduct of the enterprise. After the death of Mendana, the hostilities with the natives redoubled, and many of the Spaniards were so exhausted by sickness and hardships that a score of thoroughly determined natives might easily have gained the mastery over them. To persist in the intention of founding a settlement under such conditions would have been folly. All agreed in this, and the anchor was raised on the 18th November. Doña Isabella de Mendana's project was to go to Manila, and there to obtain recruits from amongst the colonists, with whom she would return to found a settlement. She consulted the officers, who all gave their approval in writing, and she found in Quiros a devotion and skill which were speedily to be put to a severe proof. They at once steered away from New Guinea, in order to avoid being entangled amongst the numerous archipelagos surrounding it, and also to enable them sooner to reach the Philippines, which the dilapidated state of the ships rendered necessary. After passing within sight of several islands surrounded by reefs of madrepore, upon which the crews wished to land, a permission which Quiros with great prudence always refused, after having been separated from one of the ships of the squadron, which could not or would not follow, the flotilla arrived at the Ladrone, soon to be called the Marianne Islands. The Spaniards went on shore several times to buy some provisions. The natives did not desire either their silver or gold, but set the highest value upon iron and all tools made of that metal. The narrative contains here some details upon the veneration shown by the natives towards their ancestors, which are curious enough to warrant our reproducing them verbatim. Quote, "They take out the bones from the bodies of their relations, burn the flesh, and mixing the ashes with tuba, a wine made from the cocoa palm, swallow them." They weep for the dead every year for a whole week. There are a great number of female mourners, who are to be hired for the purpose. Besides that, all the neighbours come to weep in the house of the deceased, the compliment being returned to them when the turn comes for the feast to take place at their house. These anniversaries are much frequented, all those assisting at them being liberally regaled. They weep all day and drink to intoxication all night. They recite in the midst of tears the life and deeds of the dead, beginning with the moment of his birth and dealing with the whole course of his life, recounting his strength, his height, his beauty, in a word, all that can in any way do him honour. If some amusing action occur in the recital, the company begin to laugh as if they would split their sides. Then on a sudden they drink and are again drowned in tears. There are sometimes 200 persons present at these absurd anniversaries." When the Spanish crew arrived at the Philippines, it was scarcely more than a company of skeletons, emaciated and half dead with hunger. Doña Isabella landed at Manila on the 11th February 1596 under a salute from the guns, and was solemnly received in the midst of the troops drawn up under arms. The rest of the crew, 50 having died since the departure from Santa Cruz, were housed and fed at the public expense, and the women all found husbands in Manila, except 4 or 5 who embraced the religious life. As for Doña Isabella, she was escorted back to Peru some time afterwards by Quiros, who lost no time in submitting to the Viceroy a project for a fresh voyage. But Luis de Velasco, who had succeeded Mendoza, referred the navigator to the King of Spain and the Council of the Indies, under the pretext that such a decision would overstep the limits of his authority. Quiros therefore went to Spain, and thence to Rome, where he received a kindly welcome from the Pope, who recommended him warmly to Philip III. At length, in 1605, after numberless applications and solicitations, he was empowered to fit out at Lima the 2 vessels which he should judge the most suitable for the investigation of the Australian continent and for continuing the discoveries of Mendana. With 2 ships and 1 light vessel, Quiros set out from Callao on the 21st December 1605. At 3,000 miles from Peru he had as yet discovered no land. In latitude 25 degrees south he observed a group of small islands belonging to the Dangerous archipelago. These were the Conversión de San Pablo, the Osnabrück of Wallace, and Decena, so named because it was the 10th island seen. Although this island was defended by rocks, intercourse was carried on with the natives, whose dwellings were scattered about amongst palm trees on the seashore. The natives were strong and well proportioned, and their chief wore on his head a kind of crown made of small black feathers so fine and supple that they might have been taken for silk. His fair hair, which descended to the waist, excited the wonder of the Spaniards, who, not being able to understand how a man with so tawny coloured a face could have such light yellow hair, chose to think that he was married and that he wore his wife's hair. This singular colour was only due to the habitual use of powdered lime, which burns the hair and causes it to turn yellow. This island, to which Quiros gave the name of Sagittaria, is, according to Fleurieu, Tahiti, one of the principal of the group of Society Islands. On the succeeding days Quiros sighted several other islands, upon which he did not land, and to which he gave names taken from the calendar, according to a practice which has changed all the native nomenclature of Oceania into a veritable litany. One island visited may be especially noticed. It was named the island of La Gente Hermosa, on account of the beauty of its inhabitants, and of the fair colour and coquetry of its women, who, as the Spaniards declared, even bore away the palm for grace and attractiveness from their own fellow countrywomen of Lima, whose beauty is proverbial. This island, according to Quiros, was situated upon the same parallel as Santa Cruz, to which he intended to go. He therefore sailed westward and reached an island called by the natives Taumaco, in 10 degrees south latitude and 240 miles east of Santa Cruz. This must have been one of the Duff Islands, and here Quiros was told that if he directed his course southward, he would discover a great land, of which the inhabitants were whiter than those whom he had hitherto seen. This information determined him to abandon his scheme of going to Santa Cruz. He steered in a southwesterly direction, and after having sighted several small islands, he arrived on the 1st May 1606 in a bay more than 24 miles broad. He gave to this island the name which it still bears, of Espiritu Santo. It was one of the New Hebrides group. What events happened during the stay of the ships here? The narrative is silent upon this subject, but we know from other sources that the crew mutinied, made Quiros prisoner, and abandoning the second ship and the brigantine, set out on the 11th June to return to America, where they arrived on the 3rd October 1606 after a 9 months' voyage. Monsieur Ed Charton throws no light upon this incident. He is silent upon the mutiny of the crew, and even throws all the blame of the separation upon the commander of the second vessel, Louis Vaz de Torres, who abandoned his chief in quitting Espiritu Santo. Now it is known by a letter from Torres himself to the King of Spain, published by Lord Stanley at the end of his English edition of Antoine de Morga's History of the Philippines, that he remained 15 days waiting for Quiros in the Bay of St. Philip and St. James. The officers met in council, resolved to weigh anchor on the 26th June, and to continue the search for the Australian continent. Hindered by bad weather, which prevents him from sailing round Espiritu Santo Island, assailed by the demands of a crew over whom prevails a slight breath of mutiny, Torres decides to steer to the northeast to reach the Spanish islands. In 11 degrees 30' he discovers land, which he imagines must be the commencement of New Guinea. All this land is part of New Guinea, says Torres. Quote, "It is peopled by Indians who are not very white, and who go naked, although their middles are covered with the bark of trees. They fight with javelins, bucklers, and certain clubs of stone, the whole adorned with beautiful feathers. All along this land there are other inhabited islands. Upon the whole of this coast there are numerous and vast harbours, with very broad rivers and great plains. Outside these islands stretch reefs and shallows. The islands are between these dangers and the mainland, and a channel runs between. We took possession of these harbours in your Majesty's name. Having pursued this coast for 900 miles, and seen our latitude decrease from 2½ degrees until we found ourselves in 9 degrees, at this point commenced a shoal of from 3 to 5 fathoms deep, which stretched along the coast to 7½ degrees. Not being able to proceed farther on account of the numerous shallows and powerful currents which we encountered, we decided to alter our course to the southwest, by the deep channel which has been mentioned, as far as about 11 degrees. There is there, from one end to the other, an archipelago of innumerable islands, by which I passed. At the end of the 11th degree, the bottom became deeper. There were some very large islands there, and there appeared to be more of them towards the south. They were inhabited by a black population, very robust and quite naked, bearing for arms strong and long spears, arrows, and stone clubs roughly fashioned." Modern geographers are agreed in recognizing in the localities thus described that portion of the Australian coast which ends in York Peninsula, and the extremity of New Guinea recently visited by Captain Moresby. It was known that Torres had entered the strait which has been named after him, and which divides New Guinea from Cape York, but the very recent exploration of the southeastern portion of New Guinea, of which the population has been discovered to be of a comparatively light colour and differing much from the Papoose, has just furnished an unexpected confirmation of the discoveries of Quiros. It is for this reason that we have dwelt at some length upon them, referring for the purpose to a very learned work of M.E.T. Hamy, which appeared in the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie. It behoves us now to say a few words about some travellers who explored some unfrequented countries, and furnished their contemporaries with more exact knowledge of a world until then almost unknown. The first of these travellers is François Pyrard of Laval. Having embarked in 1601 on board a St. Malo ship to go to the Indies to trade, he was wrecked in the Maldive archipelago. These islets or atolls, detached coral reefs, to the number of at least 12,000, descend into the Indian Ocean from Cape Comorin as far as the equator. The worthy Pyrard relates his shipwreck, the flight of a portion of his companions in captivity in the archipelago, and his long sojourn of 7 years upon the Maldive Islands, a stay rendered almost agreeable by the pains which he took to acquire the native language. He had plenty of time to learn the manners, customs, religion, and industries of the inhabitants, as well as to study the productions and climate of the country. Thus his narrative is filled with details of all kinds, and it retained its attractions until recent years, because travellers do not voluntarily frequent this unhealthy archipelago, the isolated situation of which had kept away foreigners and conquerors. Pyrard's narrative, therefore, is still instructive and agreeable reading. In 1607 a fleet was sent to the Maldives by the King of Bengal in order to carry off the 100 or 120 cannon which the Maldive sovereign owed to the wreck of numerous Portuguese vessels. Pyrard, notwithstanding all the liberty allowed him, and that he had become a landholder, was desirous to behold his beloved Brittany once more. He therefore eagerly embraced this opportunity of quitting the archipelago with the 3 companions who out of the whole crew alone remained with him. But the eventful travels of Pyrard were not yet concluded. Taken first to Ceylon, he was carried afterwards to Bengal, and endeavoured to reach Cochin. Before reaching this town he was captured by the Portuguese and carried prisoner to Cochin. He afterwards fell ill and was nursed in the hospital of Goa, which he only quitted to serve for 2 years as a soldier, at the end of which time he was again thrown into prison, and it was not until 1611 that he was able to revisit the good town of Laval. After so many trials, Pyrard must doubtless have felt the need of repose, and we are justified in imagining, from the silence of history as to the close of his life, that he was privileged at length to find happiness. While the honest burgess François Pyrard was, so to speak, in spite of himself, and from having indulged the desire of making a fortune too rapidly, launched into adventures in which he had to pass much of his life, circumstances of a different and romantic kind caused Pietro della Valle to determine upon travelling. Descendant of an ancient and noble family, he is by turns a soldier of the Pope and a sailor chasing Barbary corsairs. Upon his return to Rome he finds that a rival, profiting by his absence, has taken his place with a young girl whom he was to have married. So great a misfortune demands an heroic remedy, and Della Valle makes a vow of pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre. But if, as said the proverb, there is no road which does not lead to Rome, so there is no circuit so long as not to lead to Jerusalem, and of this Della Valle was to make proof. He embarks at Venice in 1614, passes 13 months at Constantinople, reaches Alexandria by sea, afterwards Cairo, and joins a caravan which at length brings him to Jerusalem. But while en route, Della Valle had no doubt imbibed a taste for a traveller's life, for he visits in succession Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and even pushes on as far as the ruins of Babylon. We must believe that Della Valle was marked out as an easy prey to love, for upon his return he becomes enamoured of a young Christian woman of Mardin, of wondrous beauty, whom he marries. One would imagine that here at length is fixed the destiny of this indefatigable traveller. Nothing of the kind. Della Valle contrives to accompany the Shah in his war against the Turks, and to traverse during 4 consecutive years the provinces of Iran. He quits Ispahan in 1621, loses his wife in the month of December of the same year, causes her to be embalmed, and has her coffin carried about in his train for 4 years longer, which he devotes to exploring Ormuz, the western coasts of India, the Persian Gulf, Aleppo, and Syria, landing at length at Naples in 1626. The countries which this singular character visited, urged on as he was by an extraordinary enthusiasm, are described by him in a shrewd, gay, and natural style, and even with some degree of fidelity. But he inaugurates the pleiad of amateur, curious, and commercial travellers. He is the first of that prolific race of tourists who each year encumber geographical literature with numerous volumes, from which the savant finds nothing to glean beyond meagre details. Tavernier is a specimen of insatiable curiosity. At 22 he has traversed France, England, the Low Countries, Germany, Switzerland, Poland, Hungary, and Italy. Then, when Europe no longer offers any food for his curiosity, he starts from Constantinople, where he remains for a year, and then arrives in Persia, where the opportunity and quelque diable aussi le poussant, he sets to work to purchase carpets, stuffs, precious stones, and those 1,000 trifles of which lovers of curiosities soon became passionately fond, and for which they were ready to pay fabulous sums. The profit which Tavernier realized from his cargo induced him to resume his travels. But like a wise and prudent man, before starting he learned from a jeweller the art of knowing precious stones. during 4 successive journeys from 1638 to 1663 he travelled over Persia, the Mogul Empire, the Indies as far as the frontier of China, and the islands of Sunda. Dazzled by the immense fortune which his traffic had obtained for him, Tavernier would play the lord, and soon saw himself on the verge of ruin, which he hoped to avert by sending one of his nephews to the East with a considerable venture, but instead his ruin was consummated by this young man, who, judging it best to appropriate the goods which had been confided to him, settled down at Ispahan. Tavernier, who was a well-educated man, made a number of interesting observations upon the history, manners, and customs of the countries which he visited. His narrative certainly contributed to give his contemporaries a much more correct idea of the countries of the East than they previously possessed. All travellers during the reign of Louis XIV take the route to the East Indies, whatever may be the end they have in view. Africa is entirely deserted, and if America be the theatre of any real exploration, it is carried out without aid from government. Whilst Tavernier was accomplishing his last and distant excursions, a distinguished archaeologist, Jean de Thévenot, nephew of Melchisedec Thévenot, a learned man to whom we owe an interesting series of travels, journeyed through Europe and visited Malta, Constantinople, Egypt, Tunis, and Italy. He brought back in 1661 an important collection of medals and monumental inscriptions, recognized nowadays as so important a help to the historian and the philologist. In 1664 he set out anew for the Levant, and visited Persia, Bassora, Surat, and India, where he saw Masulipatam, Burhampur, Aurungabad, and Golconda. But the fatigues which he had experienced prevented his return to Europe, and he died in Armenia in 1667. The success of his narratives was considerable, and was well deserved by the care and exactitude of a traveller whose scientific attainments in history, geography, and mathematics far surpassed the average level of his contemporaries. We must now speak of the amiable Bernier, the pretty philosopher, as he was entitled in his polite circle, in which were found Ninon and La Fontaine, Madame de la Sablière, Saint-Evremont, and Chapelle, without reckoning many other good and gay spirits, refractories from the stiff solemnity which then weighed upon the entourage of Louis XIV. Bernier could not escape from the fashion of travelling. After having taken a rapid survey of Syria and Egypt, he resided for 12 years in India, where his good knowledge of medicine conciliated the favour of Aurungzebe, and gave him the opportunity of beholding in detail and with profit an empire then in the full bloom of its prosperity. To the south of Hindustan, Ceylon had more than one surprise in reserve for its explorers. Robert Knox, taken prisoner by the natives, owed to this sad circumstance his long residence in the country and the collection of the first authentic documents relating to the forests and the savage natives of Ceylon. The Dutch, with a commercial jealousy which they were not singular in evincing, having until now kept secret all the information which had come to light concerning an island of which they were endeavouring to make a colony. Another merchant, Jean Chardin, the son of a rich Parisian jeweller, jealous of the successes of Tavernier, desired like him to make his fortune by trading in diamonds. The countries which attract these merchants are those of which the fame for wealth and prosperity is become proverbial. These are Persia and India, where rich costumes sparkle with jewels and gold, and where there are mines of diamonds of a fabulous size. The moment is well chosen for visiting these countries. Thanks to the Mogul emperors, civilization and art have been developed, mosques, palaces, temples have been built, and towns have risen suddenly. Their taste, that curious taste so distinctly characterized, so different from our own, is displayed in the construction of gigantic edifices, quite as much as in jewellery and goldsmiths' work, and in the manufacture of those costly trifles of which the East was beginning to be passionately fond. Like a wise man, Chardin takes a partner, as good a connoisseur as himself. At first Chardin only traversed Persia in order to reach Ormuz and to embark for the Indies. The following year he returns to Ispahan and applies himself to learn the language of the country, in order to be able to transact business directly and without any intermediary agent. He has the good fortune to please the Shah, Abbas II. From that time his fortune is made, for it is at once genteel and also the part of a prudent courtier to employ the same purveyor as his sovereign. But Chardin had another merit besides that of making a fortune. he was able to collect so considerable a mass of information concerning the government, manners, creeds, customs, towns, and populations of Persia, that his narrative has remained to our own days the vade-mecum of the traveller. This guide is so much the more precious because Chardin took care to engage at Constantinople a clever draughtsman named Grelot, by whom were reproduced the monuments, cities, scenes, costumes, and ceremonies which so well portray what Chardin called the everyday of a people. When Chardin returned to France in 1670, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, with the barbarous persecutions which resulted from it, had chased from their country great numbers of artisans, who, taking refuge in foreign countries, enriched them with our arts and manufactures. Chardin, being a Protestant, clearly perceived that his religion would hinder him from attaining to what are termed honours and advancement. As, to use his own words, "one is not free to believe what one will," he resolved to return to the Indies, "where, without being urged to a change of religion," he could not fail of attaining an honourable position. Thus liberty of conscience was at that period greater in Persia than in France. Such an assertion on the part of a man who had made the comparison is but little flattering to the grandson of Henry IV. This time, however, Chardin did not follow the same route as before. He passed by Smyrna and Constantinople, and from thence, crossing the Black Sea, he landed in the Crimea in the garb of a religious. Whilst passing through the region of the Caucasus, he had the opportunity of studying the Abkhazians and Circassians. He afterwards penetrated into Mingrelia, where he was robbed of his goods and papers, and of a portion of the jewels which he was taking back to Europe. He could not have escaped himself had it not been for the devotion to him of the Theatines, from whom he had received hospitality. But he escaped only to fall into the hands of the Turks, who, in their turn, accepted a ransom for him. After further misadventures, he arrived at Tiflis on the 17th of December 1672, and as Georgia was then governed by a prince who was a tributary of the Shah of Persia, it was easy for Chardin to reach Erivan, Tauris, and finally Ispahan. After a stay of 4 years in Persia and a concluding journey to India, during which he realized a considerable fortune, Chardin returned to Europe and settled in England, his own country on account of his religion being forbidden ground to him. The journal of his travels forms a large work in which everything that concerns Persia is especially developed. The long stay he made in the country and his intimate acquaintance with the highest personage of the state enabled him to collect numerous and authentic documents. It may fairly be said that in this way Persia was better known in the 17th century than it was 100 years later. The countries which Chardin had just explored were visited again some years later by a Dutch painter, Cornelius de Bruyn, or Le Brun. The great value of his work consists in the beauty and accuracy of the drawings which illustrate it, for as far as the text is concerned, it contains nothing which was not known before, except in what relates to the Samoyeds, whom he was the first to visit. We must now speak of the Westphalian Kampfer, almost a naturalized Swede in consequence of his long sojourn in Scandinavian countries. He refused the brilliant position which was there offered him in order to accompany as secretary an ambassador who was going to Moscow. He was thus enabled to see the principal cities of Russia, a country which at that period had scarcely entered upon the path of Western civilization. Afterwards he went to Persia, where he quitted the ambassador Fabricius in order to enter the service of the Dutch Company of the Indies, and to continue his travels. He thus visited in the first place Persepolis, Shiraz, Ormuz upon the Persian Gulf, where he was extremely ill, and whence he embarked in 1688 for the East Indies. Arabia Felix, India, the Malabar coast, Ceylon, Java, Sumatra, and Japan were afterwards all visited by him. The object of these journeys was exclusively scientific. Kampfer was a physician, but was more especially devoted to the various branches of natural history, and collected, described, drew or dried a considerable number of plants then unknown in Europe, gave new information upon their use in medicine or manufactures, and collected an immense herbarium, which is now preserved with the greater part of his manuscripts in the British Museum in London. But the most interesting portion of his narrative, nowadays indeed quite obsolete and very incomplete since the country has been opened up to our scientific men, was for a long time that relating to Japan. He had contrived to procure books treating of the history, literature, and learning of the country, when he had failed in obtaining from certain personages to whom he had rendered himself very acceptable, information which was not usually imparted to foreigners. To conclude, if all the travellers of whom we have just spoken are not strictly speaking discoverers, if they do not explore countries unknown before, they all have, in various degrees and according to their ability or their studies, the merit of having rendered the countries which they visited better known. Besides, they were able to banish to the domain of fable many of the tales which others less learned had naively accepted, and which had for long become so completely public property that nobody dreamt of disputing them. Thanks to these travellers, something is known of the history of the East, the migrations of nations began to be dimly suspected, and accounts to be given of the changes in those great empires of which the very existence had been long problematical. End of second part, chapter 5, part 2b.
Section 43 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 6, Part 1. The Great Corsair. William Dampier was born in 1612 at East Coker, and by the death of his parents was from his childhood left to his own control. Not possessing any great taste for study, he preferred running wild in the woods, and fighting with his companions, to remaining in his place on the school benches. While still young he was sent to sea as cabin boy on board merchant ships. After a voyage to Newfoundland and a campaign in the East Indies, he took service in the naval marine, and, being wounded in a battle, returned to Greenwich to be nursed. Free from any prejudices, Dampier forgot his engagement when he left the military hospital, and started for Jamaica in the position of manager of a plantation. It did not require a long trial to discover that this occupation was not to his taste. So he abandoned his negroes at the end of 6 months, and went on board a ship bound for the Bay of Campeche, where he worked for 3 years at gathering in woods for dyeing. At the end of that period he is again found in London, but the laws and the officers charged with compelling their observance are too strict for his comfort. He goes back to Jamaica, where he speedily puts himself into communication with those famous buccaneers and corsairs, who at that time did so much harm to the Spaniards. These English or French adventurers, established in the island of Tortuga, off the coast of San Domingo, had sworn implacable hatred to Spain. Their ravages were not confined to the Gulf of Mexico. They crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and devastated the coast of the Pacific Ocean, from the Strait of Magellan to California. Terror exaggerated the exploits of these pirates, which however presented something of the marvellous. It was amongst these adventurers, then commanded by Harris, Sawkins, and Shays, that Dampier enrolled himself. In 1680 we find him in Darien, where he pillages Santa Maria, endeavours in vain to surprise Panama, and with his companions, on board of some wretched canoes stolen from the Indians, captures 8 vessels, well armed, which were at anchor not far from the town. In this affair the losses of the Corsairs are so great in the fight, and the spoil is so poor, that they separate from each other. Some go back to the Gulf of Mexico, while others establish themselves upon the island of Juan Fernandez, whence shortly after they attack Arica. But here again they were so roughly handled that a new succession takes place, and Dampier is sent to Virginia, where his captain hoped to make some recruits. There Captain Cook was fitting out a vessel with the intention of reaching the Pacific by the Strait of Magellan, and Dampier joins the expedition. It begins by privateering upon the African coast, in the Cape de Verde Islands, at Sierra Leone, and in the river Scarborough, for this is the route habitually taken by the ships going to South America. In 36° south latitude, Dampier, who notes in his journal every interesting fact, remarks that the sea is become white or rather pale, but of this he cannot explain the reason, which he might easily have done had he made use of the microscope. The Sebaldine Islands are passed without incident, the Strait of Le Maire is traversed, Cape Horn is doubled on the 6th of February, 1684, and as soon as he can escape from the storms which usually assail ships entering the Pacific, Captain Cook arrives at the island of Juan Fernandez, where he hopes to revictual. Dampier wondered if he would find a Nicaraguan Indian there, who had been left behind in 1680 by Captain Sharp. This Indian had remained alone upon the island for more than 3 years. He had been in the woods hunting goats when the English captain had ordered his men to re-embark, and they had set sail without perceiving his absence. He had only his gun and his knife, with a small horn of powder and a little lead. When his powder and lead were exhausted, he had contrived to saw the barrel of his gun into small pieces with his knife, and out of them to make harpoons, spears, fish hooks, and a long knife. With these instruments he obtained all the supplies which the island afforded, goats and fish. At the distance of half a mile from the sea, he had a small hut covered with goatskins. He had no clothes left, but an animal's skin covered his loins. We have dwelt at some length upon this involuntary hermit, because he served Daniel Defoe as the original for his Robinson Crusoe, a romance which has formed the delight of every child. We shall not relate minutely all the expeditions in which Dampier participated. Suffice it to mention that in this campaign he visited the Galapagos Islands. In 1686, Dampier was serving on board of Captain Swan's ship, who, seeing that the greater part of his enterprises failed, went to the East Indies, where the Spaniards were less upon their guard, and where the Corsairs reckoned upon seizing the Manila galleon. But when our adventurers arrived at Guaham, they had only 3 days' provisions, and the sailors had plotted, if the voyage should be prolonged, to eat in turn all those who had declared themselves in favour of the voyage, and to begin with the captain who had proposed it. Dampier's turn would have come next. Thus it came to pass, says he very humorously, that after having cast anchor at Guaham, Swan embraced him and said, "Ah, Dampier, you would have made them but a sorry meal." He was right, he adds, for I was as thin and lean as he was fat and plump. Mindanao, Manila, certain parts of the Chinese coasts, the Moluccas, New Holland, and the Nicobar Islands, were the places visited and plundered by Dampier in his campaign. In the last named archipelago he became separated from his companions, and was discovered half dead upon the coast of Sumatra. During this voyage Dampier had discovered several hitherto unknown islands, and especially the Bashi group. Like the thorough adventurer he was, immediately he recovered his health, he travelled over the south of Asia, Malacca, Tonkin, Madras, and Bencoolen, where he enrolled himself as an artilleryman in the English service. 5 months afterwards he deserted and returned to London. The narrative of his adventures and his privateering obtained for him a certain amount of sympathy amongst the higher classes, and he was presented to the Earl of Oxford, Lord High Admiral. He speedily received the command of the ship Roebuck, to attempt a voyage of discovery in the seas which he had already explored. He left England on the 14th January, 1699, with the intention of passing through the Strait of Magellan, or of making the tour of Tierra del Fuego, so as to commence his discoveries on the coasts of the Pacific, which had hitherto received the visits of a comparatively small number of travellers. After crossing the line on the 10th of March, he sailed for Brazil, where the ship was revictualled. Far from being able again to descend the coast of Patagonia, he beheld himself driven by the wind to 48 miles south of the Cape of Good Hope, whence he steered east-south-east towards New Holland, a long passage which was not signalized by any adventure. On the 1st of August, Dampier saw land, and at once sought for a harbour in which to land. 5 days later he entered the Bay of Sea Dogs, upon the western coast of Australia. But he only found there a sterile soil, and met with neither water nor vegetation. Until the 31st of August he sailed along this coast, without discovering what he sought. Once, when he landed, he had a slight skirmish with some of the inhabitants, who seemed to be very thinly scattered over the country. Their chief was a young man of middle height, but quick and vigilant. His eyes were surrounded by a single ring of white paint, while a stripe of the same colour descended from the top of his forehead to the end of his nose. His chest and arms were likewise striped with white. His companions were black, fierce in aspect, their hair woolly, and in shape they were tall and slender. For 5 weeks Dampier hovered near land, and found neither water nor provisions. However, he would not give in, and intended to continue to ascend the coast northwards. But the shallows which he incessantly encountered, and the monsoon from the northwest which was soon due, obliged him to give up the enterprise, after having discovered more than 900 miles of the Australian continent. He afterwards steered towards Timor, where he intended to repose and recruit his crew, exhausted by the long voyage. But he knew very little of these parts, and his charts were quite insufficient. He was therefore obliged to make a reconnaissance of it, as if the Dutch had not already been long settled there. Thus he discovered a passage between Timor and Anamabao, in a locality in which his map only indicated a bay. The arrival of Dampier in a port known only to themselves astonished and greatly displeased the Dutch. They imagined that the English could only have reached it by means of charts taken on board a ship of their own. However, in the end they recovered from their fright, and received the strangers with kindness. Although the precursors of the monsoon were making themselves felt, Dampier again put to the sea, and steered towards the western coast of New Guinea, where he arrived on the 4th of February, 1700, near to Cape Macho of the Dutch. Amongst the things which struck him, Dampier notices the prodigious quantities of a species of pigeon, bats of extraordinary size, and scallops, a kind of shellfish, of which the empty shell weighed as much as 258 pounds. On the 7th of February he approaches King William's Island, and runs to the east, where he soon sights the Cape of Good Hope of Schouten, and the island named after that navigator. On the 24th the crew witnessed a curious spectacle. 2 fish, which had accompanied the vessel for 5 or 6 days, perceived a great sea serpent, and began to pursue it. They were about the shape and size of mackerel, but yellow and green in colour. The serpent, who fled from them with great swiftness, carried his head out of the water, and one of them attempted to seize his tail. As soon as he turned round, the first fish remained in the rear, and the other took its place. They retained the wind for a long time, always heedful to defend themselves by flight, until they were lost to view. On the 25th, Dampier gave the name of St. Matthias to a mountainous island, 30 miles long, situated above and to the east of the Admiralty Islands. Further on, at the distance of 21 or 24 miles, he discovered another island, which received the name of Squally Island, an account of violent whirlwinds which prevented him from landing upon it. Dampier believed himself to be on the coast of New Guinea, while he was in reality sailing along that of New Ireland. He endeavoured to land there, but he was surrounded by canoes carrying more than 200 natives, and the shore was covered by a large crowd. Seeing that it would be imprudent to send a boat on shore, Dampier ordered the ship to be put about. Scarcely was the order given, when the ship was assailed by showers of stones, which the natives hurled from a machine, of which Dampier could not discover the shape, but which caused the name of Slinger's Bay to be given to this locality. A single discharge of cannon stupefied the natives, and put an end to hostilities. A little further on, at some distance from the coast of New Ireland, the English discover the islands of Denis and St. John. Dampier is the first to pass through the strait which separates New Ireland from New Britain, and discovers Vulcan, Crown, Girook, Longreach, and Burning Islands. After this long cruise, distinguished by important discoveries, Dampier again steered towards the west, reached Missouri Island, and at length arrived at the island of Ceram, one of the Moluccas, where he made a somewhat long stay. He went afterwards to Borneo, passed through the Strait of Macassar, and on the 23rd of June anchored at Batavia, in the island of Java. He remained there until the 17th of October, when he set out for Europe. On arriving at the island of Ascension on the 23rd of February 1701, his vessel had so considerable a leak that it was impossible to stop it. It was necessary to run the ship aground, and to put the crew and cargo on shore. Happily, there was no want of water, turtles, goats, and land crabs, which prevented any fear of dying of hunger before some ship should call at the island and transport the shipwrecked sailors to their country. For this they had not long to wait, for on the 2nd of April an English vessel took them on board, and carried them to England. We shall have occasion again to speak of Dampier with relation to the voyages of Wood Rogers. End of second part, Chapter 6, Part 1.
Section 44 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Eaton. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 6, Part 2a. Although the attempts to find a passage by the northwest had been abandoned by the English for 20 years, they had not, however, given up the idea of seeking by that way for a passage which was only to be discovered in our own days, and of which the absolute impracticability was then to be ascertained. A clever sailor, Henry Hudson, of whom Ellis says that never did anyone better understand the seafaring profession, that his courage was equal to any emergency, and that his application was indefatigable, concluded an argument with a company of merchants to search for the passage by the northwest. On the 1st of May 1607 he sailed from Gravesend in the Hopewell, a craft about the size of one of the smallest of modern collier brigs, and having on board a crew of 12 men, and on the 13th of June reached the eastern coast of Greenland at 73 degrees, and gave it a name answering to the hopes he entertained in calling it Cape Hold with Hope. The weather here was finer and less cold than it had been 10 degrees southwards. By the 27th of June, Hudson had advanced 5 degrees more to the north, but on the 2nd of July, by one of the sudden changes which so frequently occur in these countries, the cold became severe. The sea, however, remained free, the air was still, and driftwood floated about in large quantity. On the 14th of the same month, in 33 degrees 23 minutes, the master's mate and the boatswain of the vessel landed upon a shore which formed the northern part of Spitzbergen. Traces of musk oxen and foxes, great abundance of aquatic birds, 2 streams of fresh water, one of them being warm, proved to our navigators that it was possible to live in these extreme latitudes at this period of the year. Hudson, who had re-embarked without delay, found himself arrested at the height of 82 degrees by thick pack ice, which he endeavoured in vain to penetrate or sail around. He was compelled to return to England, where he arrived on September the 15th, after having discovered an island which is probably that of Jan Mayen. The route followed in this first voyage having had no result towards the north, Hudson would try another, and accordingly set sail on April 21st in the following year, and advanced between Spitzbergen and Nova Zembla, but he could only follow for a certain distance the coast of that vast land, without being able to attain as high an elevation as he had wished for. The failure of this second attempt was more complete than that of the voyage of 1607. In consequence, the English company, which had defrayed the expenses of both attempts, declined to proceed further. This was doubtless the reason which decided Hudson to take service in Holland. The Company of Amsterdam gave him in 1609 the command of a vessel with which he set sail from the Texel at the beginning of the year. Having doubled the North Cape, he advanced along the coasts of Nova Zembla, but his crew, composed of English and Dutch, who had made voyages to the East Indies, were soon disheartened by the cold and ice. Hudson found himself forced to change his route, and to propose to his sailors, who were in open mutiny, to seek for a passage either by Davis Strait or the coast of Virginia, where, according to the information of Captain Smith, who had frequently visited them, an outlet must surely be found. The choice of his crew, little accustomed to discipline, could not be doubtful. In order not to render the outlay of the company completely abortive, Hudson was obliged to make for the Faroe Islands, to descend southward as low as 44 degrees, and to search on the coast of America for the strait, the existence of which he had been assured. On July 18th he disembarked on the continent, in order to replace his foremast, which had been broken in a storm, and he took the opportunity of bartering furs with the natives. But his undisciplined sailors, having by their exactions roused the indignation of the poor and peaceable natives, compelled him again to set sail. He continued to follow the coast until August the 3rd, and then landed a second time. At 40 degrees 30 minutes he discovered a great bay which he explored in a canoe for more than 150 miles. In the meantime his provisions began to run short, and it was impossible to procure supplies on land. The crew, which appears to have imposed its wishes on its captain during this whole voyage, assembled. Some proposed to winter in Newfoundland, in order to resume the search for the passage in the following year. Others wished to make for Ireland. This latter proposition was adopted, but when they approached the shores of Great Britain, the land proved so attractive to his men that Hudson was obliged on November the 7th to cast anchor at Dartmouth. The following year, 1610, notwithstanding all the mortifications which he had experienced, Hudson tried to renew his engagement with the Dutch company, but the terms which they named as the price of their concurrence compelled him to renounce the project, and induced him to submit to the requirements of the English company. This company imposed on Hudson as a condition that he should carry on board, rather as an assistant than a subordinate, a clever seaman named Colburn, in whom they had full confidence. It is easy to understand how mortifying this condition was to Hudson. Accordingly he took the earliest opportunity of ridding himself of the superintendent who had been imposed upon him. He had not yet left the Thames, when he sent Colburn back to shore with a letter for the company, in which he endeavoured to palliate and justify this certainly very strange proceeding. Towards the end of May, when the ship had cast anchor in one of the ports of the island, the crew formed on the subject of Colburn its first conspiracy, which was repressed without difficulty, and when Hudson quitted the island on June the 1st, he had re-established his authority. After having passed Frobisher's Strait, he sighted the land of desolation of Davis, entered the strait which has received his name, and speedily penetrated into a wide bay, the entire western coast of which he examined until the beginning of September. At this epoch, one of the inferior officers, continuing to excite revolt against his chief, was superseded, but this act of justice only exasperated the sailors. In the early part of November, Hudson, having arrived at the extremity of the bay, sought for an appropriate spot to winter in, and having soon found one, drew up the ship on dry land. It is difficult to understand such a resolution. On the one hand, Hudson had left England with provisions for 6 months only, which had already been largely reduced, and he could scarcely reckon, considering the barrenness of the country, upon procuring a further supply of nourishment. On the other, the crew had exhibited such numerous signs of mutiny that he could hardly rely upon its discipline and goodwill. Nevertheless, although the English were often obliged to content themselves with scanty rations, they did not, owing to the arrival of great numbers of birds, pass a very distressing winter. But on the return of spring, as soon as the ship was prepared to resume her route to England, Hudson found that his fate was decided. He made his arrangements accordingly, distributed to each his share of biscuit, paid the wages due, and awaited the course of events. He had not long to wait. The conspirators seized their captain, his son, a volunteer, the carpenter, and 5 sailors, put them on board a boat, without arms, provisions, or instruments, and abandoned them to the mercy of the ocean. The culprits reached England again, but not all. 2 were killed in an encounter with the Indians, another died of sickness, while the others were sorely tried by famine. Eventually, no prosecution was commenced against them. Only the company in 1674 procured employment on board a vessel for the son of Henry Hudson, lost in the discovery of the North West, the son being entirely destitute of resources. The expeditions of Hudson were followed by those of Button and of Gibbons, to whom we owe, if not new discoveries, important observations on the tides, the variation of the weather and the temperature, and on a number of natural phenomena. In 1615, the English company entrusted to Baillet, who had taken part in the last voyages, the command of a vessel of 50 tons. Her name, the Discovery, was of good augury. She carried as pilot the famous William Baffin, whose renown has eclipsed that of his captain, setting sail from England on April 13th. The English explorers sighted Cape Farewell by the 6th of May, passed from the islands of Desolation to the Savage Islands, where they met with a great number of natives, and ascended north-westward as high as 64 degrees. On July the 10th land appeared on the starboard, and the tide flowed from the north, from which they conceived so much hope of the passage sought for, that they gave to the cape, discovered on this spot, the name of Comfort. It was probably Cape Walsingham, for they ascertained, after doubling it, that the land inclined towards the north-east and the east. It was at the entry of Davis Strait that their discoveries came to an end for this year. They returned to Plymouth on September the 9th without having lost a single man. So strong were the hopes entertained by Baillet and Baffin that they obtained permission to put to sea again in the same vessel the following year. On May the 14th, 1616, after a voyage in which nothing worthy of remark occurred, the 2 captains penetrated into Davis Strait, sighted Cape Henderson's Hope, the extreme point formerly reached by Davis, and ascended as high as 72 degrees 40 minutes to the Women's Island, thus named after some Esquimaux females whom they met with. On June the 12th, Baillet and Baffin were forced by the ice to enter a bay on the coast. Some Esquimaux brought them a great quantity of horns, without doubt tusks of walruses, or horns of musk oxen, from which they named the bay Horn Sound. After remaining some days in this place, they were able to put to sea again. On setting out from 75 degrees 40 minutes, they encountered a vast expanse of water free from ice, and penetrated without much danger beyond the 78 degree of latitude to the entrance of the strait, which prolonged northwards the immense bay which they had just traversed, and which received the name of Baffin. Then turning to the west, and afterwards to the southwest, Byleth and Baffin discovered the Carey Islands, Jones Strait, Coburg Island, and Lancaster Strait, and afterwards they descended along the entire western shore of Baffin's Bay as far as Cumberland Land. Despairing then of being able to carry his discoveries further, Byleth, who had several men amongst his crew afflicted with scurvy, found himself obliged to return to the shores of England, where he disembarked at Dover on August 30th. If this expedition terminated again in failure, in the sense that the North West Passage was not discovered, the results obtained were nevertheless considerable. Byleth and Baffin had prodigiously increased the knowledge of the seas and coasts in the quarters of Greenland. The captain and the pilot, in writing to the director of the company, assured him that the bay which they had visited was an excellent spot for fishing, in which thousands of whales, seals, and walruses disported themselves. The event could not be long in amply proving the correctness of this information. Let us now descend again upon the coast of America, as far as Canada, and see what had happened since the time of Jacques Cartier. This latter, we may remember, had made an attempt at colonisation, which had not produced any important results. Nevertheless, some Frenchmen had remained in the country, had married there, and founded families of colonists. From time to time they received reinforcements brought by fishing vessels from Dieppe or St. Malo, but it was difficult to establish a current of emigration. It was under these circumstances that a gentleman named Samuel de Champlain, a veteran of the wars of Henry IV, and who for 2 years and a half had frequented the East Indies, was engaged by the commander of chasse with the Sieur de Pontgravé to continue the discoveries of Jacques Cartier, and to choose the situations most favourable for the establishment of towns and centres of population. This is not the place for us to consider the manner in which Champlain understood the business of a colonizer, nor his great services, which might well entitle him to be called the father of Canada. We will therefore advisedly leave this aspect of his undertaking, not the least brilliant, in order simply to occupy ourselves with the discoveries which he effected in the interior of the continent. Setting sail from Honfleur on March the 15th, 1603, the two chiefs of the enterprise first ascended the St. Lawrence as far as the harbour of Tadoussac, 240 miles from its mouth. They were welcomed by the populations, which had, however, neither faith nor law, and lived without God and without religion, like brute beasts. At this place they quitted their ships, which could not have advanced further without danger, and reached in a boat the fall of St. Louis, where Jacques Cartier had been stopped. They even penetrated a little into the interior, and then returned to France, where Champlain printed a narrative of the voyage for the king. Henry IV resolved to continue the enterprise. In the meantime, M. de Chasse having died, his privilege was transferred to M. de Monts, with the title of Vice-Admiral and Governor of Acadia. Champlain accompanied M. de Monts to Canada, and passed 3 whole years, whether in aiding by his counsels and his exertions the efforts of colonisation, or in exploring the coasts of Acadia, the bearings of which he took beyond Cape Cod, or in making excursions into the interior, and visiting the savage tribes which it was important to conciliate. In 1607, after a new voyage to France to recruit colonists, Champlain returned again to New France, and founded in 1608 a town which was to become Quebec. The following year was devoted to again ascending the St. Lawrence and ascertaining its course. On board of a pirogue, with 2 companions only, Champlain penetrated with some Algonquins to the Iroquois, and remained conqueror in a great battle fought on the borders of a lake which has received his name. He then descended the river Richelieu as far as the St. Lawrence. In 1610 he made a fresh incursion into the territory of the Iroquois at the head of his allies, the Algonquins, whom he had the greatest possible difficulty in making observe the European discipline. In this campaign he employed instruments of warfare which greatly astonished the savages and easily secured him the victory. For the attack of a village he constructed a cavalier of wood, which 200 of the most powerful men carried before this village to within a pike's length, and displayed 3 arquebusiers well protected from the arrows and stones which might be shot or launched at them. A little later we see him exploring the river Ottawa, and advancing in the north of the continent to within 225 miles of Hudson's Bay. After having fortified Montreal in 1615, he twice ascended the Ottawa, explored Lake Huron, and arrived by land at Lake Ontario, which he crossed. It is very difficult to divide into 2 parts a life so occupied as Champlain's. All his excursions, all his reconnaissances, had but one object, the development of the work to which he had consecrated his existence. Thus detached from what gives them their interest, they appear to us unimportant, and yet if the colonial policy of Louis XIV and his successor had been different, we would possess in America a colony which assuredly would not yield in prosperity to the United States. Notwithstanding our abandonment, Canada has preserved a fervent love for the mother country. End of second part, Chapter 6, Part 2a. Section 45 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 6, Part 2b. We must now leap over a period of 40 years to arrive at Robert Cavelier de la Salle. During this time the French establishments have acquired some importance in Canada, and having extended themselves over a great part of North America, our hunters and trappers scour the woods, and bring every year with their load of furs new information respecting the interior of the continent. In this latter task they are powerfully seconded by the missionaries, in the first rank of whom we must place Father Marquette, whom the extent of his voyages on the Great Lakes and as far as the Mississippi marks out for special acknowledgment. 2 men, besides, deserve to be mentioned for the encouragements and facilities which they afforded to the explorers, viz. M. de Frontenac, Governor of New France, and Talon, Intendant of Justice and Police. In 1678 there arrived in Canada, without any settled purpose, a young man named Cavelier de la Salle. He was born at Rouen, says Father Charlevoix, of a family in easy circumstances, but having passed some years with the Jesuits, he had had no share in the inheritance of his parents. He had a cultivated mind, he wished to distinguish himself, and he felt within himself sufficient genius and courage to ensure success. In reality, he was not deficient in resolution to enter upon, nor in perseverance to follow up an undertaking, nor in firmness in contending against obstacles, nor in resource to repair his losses, but he knew not how to make himself loved, nor how to manage those of whom he stood in need, and when he had attained authority, he exercised it with harshness and arrogance. With such defects he could not be happy, and in fact he was not. Father Charlevoix's portrait appears to us somewhat too black, and he does not seem to estimate at its true value the great discovery which we owe to Cavelier de la Salle, a discovery which has nothing like it. We do not say equal to it, except that of the river Amazon by Orellana in the 16th century, and that of the Congo by Stanley in the 19th. However this may be, no sooner had he arrived in the country than he set himself with extraordinary application to study the native idioms, and to associate with the savages in order to render himself familiar with their manners and habits. At the same time he gathered from the trappers a mass of information on the situation of the rivers and lakes. He communicated his projects of exploration to M. de Frontenac, who encouraged him and gave him the command of a fort constructed at the outlet of the lake into the St. Lawrence. In the meantime, one Joliet arrived at Quebec. He brought the news that, in company with Father Marquette and 4 other persons, he had reached a great river called the Mississippi, flowing towards the south. Cavelier de La Salle very soon understood what advantage might be derived from an artery of this importance, especially if the Mississippi had, as he believed, its mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. By the lakes and the Illinois, an affluent of the Mississippi, it was easy to effect communication between the St. Lawrence and the Sea of the Antilles. What marvellous profit would France derive from this discovery? La Salle explained the project which he had conceived to the Count of Frontenac, and obtained from him very pressing letters of recommendation to the Minister of Marine. On arriving in France, La Salle learned the death of Colbert, but he remitted to his son, the Marquis of Seignelay, who had succeeded him, the dispatches of which he was the bearer. This project, which appeared to rest upon solid foundations, could not fail to please a young minister. Accordingly, Seignelay presented La Salle to the king, who caused letters of nobility to be prepared for him, granted him the seigneury of Catarocouy, and the government of the fort which he had built, with the monopoly of commerce in the countries which he might discover. La Salle had also found means to procure the patronage of the Prince de Conti, who asked him to take with him the Chevalier Tonty, son of the inventor of the tontine, in whom he felt an interest. He was for La Salle a precious acquisition. Tonty, who had made a campaign in Sicily, where his hand had been carried off by the explosion of a grenade, was a brave and skilful officer, who always showed himself extremely devoted. La Salle and Tonty embarked at Rochelle on July 14, 1678, carrying with them about 30 men, workmen and soldiers, and a Recollet monk, Father Hennepin, who accompanied them in all their voyages. Then La Salle, being conscious that the execution of his project required more considerable resources than those which were at his disposal, constructed a boat upon the Lake Erie, and devoted a whole year to scouring the country, visiting the Indians, and carrying on an active trade in furs, which he stored in his fort of Niagara, while Tonty pursued the same course in other directions. At length, towards the middle of August of the year 1679, his boat, the Griffin, being prepared for sailing, he embarked on the Lake Erie with 30 men and 3 fathers Recollets for Michilimackinac. In crossing the lakes St. Clair and Huron, he experienced a violent storm, which caused the desertion of some of his people, whom, however, Tonty brought back to him. La Salle arrived at Michilimackinac and very soon entered the Green Bay, but during this time his creditors at Quebec had sold all that he possessed, and the Griffin, which he had dispatched laden with furs to the fort of Niagara, was either lost or pillaged by the Indians. Which of these took place has never been precisely ascertained. For himself, although the departure of the Griffin had displeased his companions, he continued his route and reached the river St. Joseph, where he found an encampment of Miamis, and where Tonty speedily rejoined him. Their first care was to construct a fort on this spot. Then they crossed the dividing line of the water between the basin of the Great Lakes and that of the Mississippi. They subsequently reached the river of the Illinois, an affluent on the left of that great river. With his small band of followers, upon whose fidelity he could not entirely depend, the situation of La Salle was critical. In the midst of an unknown country, and among a powerful nation, the Illinois, who at first allies of France, had been prejudiced and excited against us by the Iroquois and the English, jealous of the progress of the Canadian colony. Nevertheless, it was necessary at all cost to attach to himself these Indians, who from their situation were able to hinder all communication between La Salle and Canada. In order to strike their imagination, Cavelier de La Salle proceeds to their encampment, where more than 3,000 men are assembled. He has but 20 men, but he traverses their village haughtily and stops at some distance. The Illinois, who have not yet declared war, are surprised. They advance towards him and overwhelm him with pacific demonstrations. So versatile is the spirit of the savages. Such an impression does every mark of courage make upon them. Without delay, La Salle takes advantage of their friendly dispositions, and erects upon the very site of their camp a small fort, which he calls Bekere, in allusion to the troubles which he has already experienced. There he leaves Tonti with all his people, and he himself, anxious about the fate of the Griffin, returns with 3 Frenchmen and 1 Indian to the fort of Catarocouy, separated by 500 leagues from Crèvecoeur. Before setting out he had detached with Father Hennepin one of his companions named Engan on a mission to reascend the Mississippi beyond the river of the Illinois, and if possible to its source. These 2 travellers, says Father Charlevoix, set out from the fort of Crèvecoeur on February the 28th, and having entered the Mississippi, ascended it as far as 46 degrees of north latitude. There they were stopped by a considerable waterfall extending quite across the river, to which Father Hennepin gave the name of St. Anthony of Padua. Then they fell, I know not by what mischance, into the hands of the Sioux, who kept them for a long time prisoners. On his journey back to Catarocouy, La Salle, having discovered a new site appropriate to the construction of a fort, summoned Tonti thither, who immediately set to work, while La Salle continued his route. This is Fort St. Louis. On his arrival at Catarocouy, La Salle learned news which would have broken down a man of less hardy temperament. Not only had the Griffin, on board of which he had furs of the value of 10,000 crowns, been lost, but a vessel which was bringing him from France a cargo worth 880 L had been shipwrecked, and his enemies had spread a report of his death. Having no further business at Catarocouy, and having proved by his presence that the reports of his disappearance were all false, he arrived again at the fort of Crèvecoeur, where he was much astonished to find no one. This is what had happened. While the Chevalier Tonti was employed in the construction of Fort St. Louis, the garrison of Fort Crèvecoeur had mutinied, had pillaged the magazines, had done the same at Fort Miami, and then fled to Michilimackinac. Tonti, almost alone in the face of the Illinois, who were roused against him by the depredations of his men, and judging that he could not resist in his fort of Crèvecoeur, had left it on September the 11th, 1680, with the 5 Frenchmen who composed his garrison, and had retired as far as the bay of the Lake Michigan. After having placed a garrison at Crèvecoeur and at Fort St. Louis, La Salle came to Michilimackinac, where he rejoined Tonti, and together they set out again from thence towards the end of August for Catarocouy, whence they embarked on the Lake Erie with 55 persons on August 28, 1681. After a journey of 240 miles along the frozen river of the Illinois, they reached Fort Crèvecoeur, where the water, free from ice, permitted the use of their canoes. On February the 6th, 1682, La Salle arrived at the confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi. He descended the river, sighted the mouth of the Missouri and that of the Ohio, where he raised a fort, penetrated into the country of the Arkansas, of which he took possession in the name of France, crossed the country of the Natchez, with whom he made a treaty of friendship, and finally passed out into the Gulf of Mexico on April the 9th, after a navigation of 1,050 miles in a mere bark. The anticipations so skilfully conceived by Cavelier de Salle were realized. He immediately took formal possession of the country, to which he gave the name of Louisiana, and called the immense river which he had just discovered the St. Louis. La Salle's return to Canada occupied not less than 1 year and a half. There is no ground for astonishment when all the obstacles scattered in his path are considered. What energy, what strength of mind were requisite in one of the greatest travellers of whom France has reason to be proud, to succeed in such an enterprise. Unhappily, a man, otherwise well intentioned, but who allowed himself to be prejudiced against La Salle by his numerous enemies, M. Lefebvre de la Barre, who had succeeded M. de Frontenac as governor of Canada, wrote to the Minister of Marine that the discoveries of La Salle were not to be regarded as of much importance. This traveller, he said, was actually, with about 20 French vagabonds and savages, at the extremity of the bay, where he played the part of sovereign, plundered and ransomed those of his own nation, exposed the people to the incursions of the Iroquois, and covered all these acts of violence with the pretext of the permission which he had from His Majesty to carry on commerce alone in the countries which he might be able to discover. Cavelier de la Salle could not allow himself to remain exposed to these calumnious imputations. On the one side, honour prompted him to return to France to exculpate himself. On the other, he would not leave others to reap the profit of his discoveries. He set out therefore, and received from Seignelay a kindly welcome. The minister had not been much influenced by the letters of M. de la Barre. He was aware that men could not accomplish great achievements without wounding much self-love, nor without making numerous enemies. La Salle took the opportunity to explain to him his project of discovering the mouth of the Mississippi by sea, in order to open a way for French vessels, and to found an establishment there. The minister entered into these views, and gave him a commission which placed Frenchmen and savages under his orders, from Fort St. Louis to the sea. At the same time, the commandment of the squadron, which was to transport him to America, was to be under his authority, and to furnish him, on his disembarkation, with all the succours which he might require, provided that nothing was done to the prejudice of the king. 4 vessels, one of them a frigate of 40 guns, commanded by M. de Beaujeu, were to carry 280 persons, including the crews, to the mouth of the Mississippi, to form the nucleus of the new colony. Soldiers and artisans had been very badly chosen, as was perceived when too late, and no one knew his business. Setting sail from La Rochelle on July the 24th, 1684, the little squadron was almost immediately obliged to return to port, the bowsprit of the frigate having broke suddenly in the very finest weather. The inexplicable accident was the commencement of misunderstanding between M. de Beaujeu and M. de La Salle. The former could scarcely be pleased to see himself subordinated to a private individual, and did not forgive Cavelier this. Nothing, however, would have been more easy than to decline the command. La Salle had not the gentleness of manner and the politeness necessary to conciliate his companions. The disagreement did but gather force during the voyage by reason of the obstacles raised by M. de Beaujeu to the rapidity and secrecy of the expedition. The annoyances of La Salle had indeed become so great when he arrived at St. Domingo, that he fell seriously ill. He recovered, however, and the expedition set sail again on November 25th. A month later it was off Florida, but, as La Salle had been assured that in the Gulf of Mexico all the currents bore eastwards, he did not doubt that the mouth of the Mississippi must be far to the west, an error which was the source of all his misfortunes. La Salle then steered to the west, and passed by without perceiving it, without deigning even to attend to certain signs which he was asked to observe, the mouth of the Mississippi. When he perceived his mistake, and entreated M. de Beaujeu to turn back, the latter would no longer consent. La Salle, seeing that he could make no impression upon the contradictory mind of his companion, decided to disembark his men and his provisions in the Bay of St. Bernard. Yet, in this very last act, Beaujeu manifested an amount of culpable ill will, which did as little honour to his judgment as to his patriotism. Not only was he unwilling to land all the provisions, under the pretext that certain of them being at the bottom of the hold, he had no time to change his stowage, but further he gave shelter on board his own ship to the master and crew of the transport, laden with the stores, utensils, and implements necessary for a new establishment, people whom everything seems to convict of having purposely cast their vessel upon shore. At the same time, a number of savages took advantage of the disorder caused by the shipwreck of the transport to plunder everything on which they could lay their hands. Nevertheless, La Salle, who had the talent of never appearing depressed by misfortune, and who found in his own genius resources adapted to the circumstances of the case, ordered the works of the establishment to be begun. In order to give courage to his companions, he more than once took part with his own hands in the work, but very slow progress was made, in consequence of the ignorance of the workmen. Struck with the resemblance of the language and habits of the Indians of these parts to those of the Mississippi, La Salle was very soon persuaded that he was not far distant from that river, and made several excursions in order to approach it. But if he found a country beautiful and fertile, he did not make progress towards what he was in search of. He returned each time to the fort more gloomy and more harsh, and this was not the way to restore calm to spirits embittered by sufferings and the inutility of their efforts. Grain had been sown, but scarcely any came up for want of rain, and what had sprung up was soon laid waste by the savages and the deer. The hunters who wandered far from the camp were massacred by the Indians, and sickness found an easy prey in men overwhelmed with ennui, disappointment, and misery. In a short time the number of the colonists fell to 37. At length La Salle resolved to try a last effort to reach the Mississippi, and in descending the river to seek help from the nations with which he had made alliance. He set out on January 12, 1687, with his brother, his 2 nephews, 2 missionaries, and 12 colonists. He was approaching the country of the Shawnees, when, in consequence of an altercation between one of his nephews and 3 of his companions, these latter assassinated the young man and his servant during their sleep, and resolved immediately to do the same with the chief of the enterprise. De La Salle, uneasy at not seeing his nephew return, set out to seek him on the morning of the 19th with Father Anastase. The assassins, seeing him approach, lay in ambush in a thicket, and one of them shot him in the head and stretched him on the ground stark dead. Thus perished Cavelier de La Salle, a man of capacity, says Father Charlevoix, of a largeness of mind, of a courage and firmness of soul, which might have led him to the achievement of something great, if, with so many great qualities, he had known how to master his gloomy and atrabilious disposition, and to soften the severity, or rather the harshness, of his nature. Many calumnies had been spread abroad against him, but it is necessary so much the more to be on our guard against all these malevolent reports, as it is only too common to exaggerate the defects of the unfortunate, to impute to them even some which they had not, especially when they had given occasion for their misfortune, and have not known how to make themselves beloved. What is sadder for the memory of this celebrated man is that he has been regretted by few persons, and that the ill success of his undertakings, only of his last, has given him the air of an adventurer among those who judge only by appearances. Unhappily, these are usually the most numerous, and in some degree the voice of the public. We have but little to add to these last wise words. La Salle knew not how to obtain pardon for his first success. We have related subsequently by what concurrence of circumstances his second enterprise miscarried. He died the victim, it may be said, of the jealousy and malevolence of the Chevalier de Beaujeu. It is to this slight cause that we owe the failure to found in America a powerful colony, which would very soon have been found in a condition to compete with the English establishments. We have narrated the beginning of the English colonies. The events which took place in England were highly favourable to them. The religious persecutions, the revolutions of 1648 and 1688, furnished numerous recruits, who, animated by an excellent spirit, set themselves to work, and transported to the other side of the Atlantic the art, the industry, and in a short time the prosperity of the mother country. Very soon the immense forests which covered Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Carolina fell beneath the hatchet of the squatter, and the soil became cleared, while the hunters of the woods, driving back the Indians, made the interior of the country better known, and prepared the work of civilization. In Mexico, in the whole of Central America, in Peru, in Chile, and on the shores of the Atlantic, a different state of things prevailed. The Spaniards had extended their conquests, but far from acting like the English, they had reduced the Indians to slavery. Instead of applying themselves to the cultivation appropriate to the variety of the climates and of the countries of which they had made themselves masters, they sought only in the produce of the mines the resources and prosperity which they should have endeavoured to obtain from the land. If a country can thus rapidly attain prodigious wealth, yet this factitious system cannot last long. With the mines, a prosperity which does not renew itself must ere long become exhausted. The Spaniards could not fail to experience the sad result. Thus then, at the end of the 17th century, a great part of the New World was known. In North America, Canada, the shores of the Atlantic and of the Gulf of Mexico, the valley of Mississippi, the coasts of California and of New Mexico were discovered or colonized. All the central part of the continent from Rio del Norte as far as terra firma was subject, at least nominally, to the Spaniards. In the south, the savannas and the forests of Brazil, the pampas of Argentine, and the interior of Patagonia escaped the observation of the explorers, as they were destined to do for a long time yet. In Africa, the long line of coasts, which are washed by the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, had been patiently followed and observed by navigators. At some points only, colonists and missionaries had tried to penetrate the mystery of this vast continent. Senegal, Congo, the valley of the Nile, the Abyssinia, were all that were known with some degree of detail and of certainty. In many of the countries of Asia, surveyed by the travellers of the Middle Ages, had not been revisited since that epoch. We had carefully explored the whole anterior part of that continent. India had been revealed to us. We had even founded some establishments there. China had been touched by our missionaries, and Japan, that famous Cipango which had exercised so great an attraction for our travellers of the preceding age, was at length known to us. Only Siberia and the whole north-east angle of Asia had escaped our investigations, and it was not yet known whether America was not connected with Asia, a mystery which was before long to be cleared up. In Oceania, a number of archipelagos, of islands and separate islets, remained still to be discovered, but the islands of Sunda were colonised, the coasts of Australia and of New Zealand had been partially revealed, and the existence of that great continent, which according to Tasman extended from Tierra del Fuego to New Zealand, began to be doubted. But it still required the long and careful researches of Cook to banish definitely into the domain of fable a chimera so long cherished. Geography was on the point of transforming itself. The great discoveries made in astronomy were about to be applied to geography. The labours of Fresnel, and above all of Picard, upon the measure of a terrestrial degree between Paris and Amiens, had made it clear that the globe is not a sphere, but a spheroid, that is to say, a ball flattened at the poles and swollen at the equator, and thus were found at one stroke the form and the dimensions of the world which we inhabit. At length the labours of Picard, continued by La Hire and Cassini, were completed at the commencement of the following century. The astronomical observations, rendered possible by the calculation of the satellites of Jupiter, enabled us to rectify our maps. If this rectification had been already effected with regard to certain places, it became indispensable when the number of points of which the astronomical position had been observed had been considerably increased, and this was to be the work of the next century. At the same time, historical geography was more studied. It began to take for its foundation the study of inscriptions, and archaeology was about to become one of the most useful instruments of comparative geography. In a word, the 17th century is an epoch of transition and of progress. It seeks and it finds the powerful means which its successor, the 18th century, was destined to put into operation. The era of the sciences has already opened, and with it the modern world commences. End of the second part, Chapter 6, Part 2b. End of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne.